What if everything we've been taught about ancient Greece, the democracy, the philosophy, the Olympic glory, was only half the story? What if beneath the marble statues and soaring rhetoric lived a society built on violence, slavery, and brutality that would shock the modern world? Tonight, we're tearing down the sanitized version of ancient Greece you learned in school. We're diving into 30 documented, verified truths about Greek civilization. Truths that historians know, but textbooks often gloss over. These aren't myths or legends. They're archaeological facts, recorded in their own words, preserved in stone and papyrus. The moonlight falls across the slopes of Mount Taygetus, outside Sparta. A father climbs the rocky path, his face expressionless. In his arms, wrapped in cloth, is his 5-day-old son. The infant has a slightly twisted foot. The father reaches a specific outcropping, a place worn smooth by centuries of use, and sets the bundle down. Then he turns and walks away. The child's cries echo off the rocks until, hours or days later, they stop. This wasn't murder in Greek eyes. This was apotheosis, exposure, and it happened across the Greek world, in every city-state, for over 1,000 years. Here's what actually happened. In ancient Greece, a newborn wasn't automatically considered part of the family. The father had absolute legal authority to decide whether the child would be raised or exposed, left outside to die from the elements, starvation, or wild animals. In Athens, this decision was made within 7 days of birth. In Sparta, the state got involved. A council of elders examined newborns, and any deemed weak were ordered exposed. The reasons were pragmatic and horrifying. Deformed children, exposed. Female children in families that already had daughters, exposed. Children born during times of famine, exposed. Children whose paternity was questioned, exposed. The scholar William V. Harris estimates that in some Greek cities, 10–20% of all infants were deliberately exposed. Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle, the great philosopher, wrote about it casually in his Politics. As to the exposure and rearing of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live. He wasn't proposing something new. He was describing standard practice. Archaeological evidence confirms the textual record. Excavations of ancient wells and refuse pits have uncovered the remains of newborn infants, often showing signs of deliberate disposal. At Ashdod, a well contained the bones of nearly 100 infants. At Athens, similar discoveries. The pattern is undeniable, but here's what makes it darker. Exposure wasn't hidden or shameful. It was legal, public, and considered responsible family planning. Families would leave infants at specific locations, certain hillsides, crossroads, or refuse heaps, where they might theoretically be rescued by childless couples, or, more often, by slave traders who would raise them for profit. The poet Posidippus wrote in the 3rd century BCE, "Everyone raises a son even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter even if he is rich." The casual acceptance is chilling. Greek playwrights used exposure as a plot device constantly. Oedipus, Ion, and dozens of other characters were exposed infants who survived. These stories reflect how common the practice was. And this wasn't ancient prehistory. Exposure continued throughout the classical period, the Hellenistic age, and into the Roman era. From roughly 800 BCE to 400 CE, Greek civilization systematically practiced infanticide for over a millennium. The father on Mount Taygetus wasn't a monster. He was following the law. Autumn in Sparta, the 5 ephors, the highest magistrates, gather in the council chamber. Before them sits a declaration written on wax tablets. They sign it without discussion. It's a formality repeated every single year for centuries. The declaration reads, "The Helots are our enemies." With that signature, every Helot, the enslaved Greek population that outnumbered Spartan citizens 7–1, became fair game. For the next year, any Spartan could kill any Helot without legal consequence. It wasn't murder, it was warfare. This is the Crypteia, and it's completely real. Here's the documented truth. Sparta's entire society rested on the backs of the Helots. Enslaved Greeks from Messenia and Laconia conquered generations earlier. These weren't foreigners bought at slave markets. They were Greeks, enslaved by other Greeks, bound to the land they farmed. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, and vastly outnumbered their masters. The Spartans lived in constant fear of Helot rebellion, so they institutionalized terror. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Lycurgus. The magistrates would dispatch the most capable young Spartans into the countryside, with nothing but daggers and basic rations. During the day they would scatter and hide, resting in concealment. At night, they would come down to the roads and kill any helot they caught. The cryptia served multiple purposes. First, terror. Helots needed to know that any night a knife might find them in the dark. Second, population control. The strongest, most capable helots, those who might lead revolts, were specifically targeted. Third, training. Young Spartan men learned to kill without hesitation, to hunt humans as practice for war. But the annual declaration of war was legal genius. Greek law prohibited murder, even of slaves. But enemies in wartime? Those can be killed freely. By declaring the helots enemies each year, Sparta created a legal framework for systematic terror. The historian Thucydides records what happened when Sparta felt particularly threatened in 424 BCE. They announced that helots who had served bravely in battle could earn their freedom. 2,000 came forward. The Spartans selected them, crowned them with wreaths, and led them to the temples, pretending to celebrate their freedom. Then they quietly murdered all 2,000. And no one knew how each of them perished, Thucydides writes, with barely concealed horror. This wasn't an aberration. This was policy. Myron of Priene, quoted by Athenaeus, describes how helots were systematically humiliated. They were forced to wear dogskin caps and rough clothing to mark their status. They were compelled to drink unmixed wine until they vomited, then paraded before young Spartans as a warning against drunkenness. They were beaten annually, regardless of whether they had done anything wrong, so they would remember they were slaves. The helots did eventually revolt. The Great Helot Uprising of 464 BCE nearly destroyed Sparta, but Sparta crushed it, and the terror continued for another 2 centuries. Sparta, the society we romanticize for its warriors and discipline, maintained its power through annual declarations of war against enslaved Greeks. The cryptia wasn't a legend or a one-time event. It was systematic, legal, state-sanctioned terrorism that lasted for hundreds of years. Summer, 416 BCE. The island of Melos, small and neutral, surrounded by the Athenian fleet. Inside the city walls, the Melian leaders receive Athenian ambassadors. They expect negotiations. What they get is a philosophy lesson about power that would make Machiavelli blush. This is the Melian dialogue, one of the most chilling conversations in recorded history. And Thucydides, the historian, preserved it word for word. Here's what happened. Athens was at war with Sparta. Melos, a small island colony originally founded by Sparta, wanted to remain neutral. Athens said no. Submit or die. The Melian leaders appealed to justice, to divine law, to the basic morality of not slaughtering neutral populations. The Athenian response is documented in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and it's brutally honest. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The Athenians laid it out plainly. We know that you, like others, when you see that the circumstances are too strong for you, will recognize the prudent course. Justice is considered only between equals in power. The strong exact what they can, and the weak yield what they must. No appeals to morality. No pretense of just war. Just naked power. The Melians tried reason, but surely it is in your interest to not destroy us. Others will fear you and resist more fiercely. The Athenians. That's our concern, not yours. Submit. The Melians tried divine justice. The gods will protect us because our cause is just. The Athenians. We believe that of the gods, by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can. We didn't make this law, we just act on it. The Athenians were saying out loud, in diplomatic negotiations, might makes right, the gods favor the strong, and morality is irrelevant. This from Athens, birthplace of democracy, home of Socrates, beacon of wisdom. The Melians refused to surrender. They bet on Spartan help, on divine intervention, on fortune. They lost. After a siege, Athens took the city. Thucydides records what happened next with characteristic brevity. The Athenians executed all the adult males they captured and enslaved the women and children. All of them, every man on the island, killed, every woman and child sold into slavery. A neutral city-state, wiped from existence, its population murdered or enslaved. The island was then colonized by Athenian settlers. This wasn't done by tyrants or barbarians. This was done by the Athenian democracy, the same democracy we celebrate as humanity's great experiment in self-governance. The assembly voted on this. Citizens debated it in the agora. Philosophers walked the streets of Athens while Melian children were being sold in slave markets. And here's the pattern. Melos wasn't unique. When Mytilene rebelled in 427 BCE, Athens initially voted to execute all adult males. They only changed their minds the next day. When Cyone rebelled in 421 BCE, Athens executed all the men and enslaved the women and children. The Athenians even had a name for this strategy, andropedismos, the enslavement of an entire population after conquest. It was standard military policy. The ruins of ancient Melos are still there. You can visit them, but you won't find any Melians. Democracy did this. The Plain of Marathon, 490 BCE. The Greek phalanx advances, 8 ranks deep, bronze shields locked together, spears bristling forward. From the Persian perspective, it must have looked like a bronze wall coming to crush them. That's exactly what it was, and it was designed to be as terrifying and brutal as possible. Here's what textbooks tell you. The Greek phalanx was a brilliant tactical innovation, a formation of citizen soldiers fighting together. Here's what they don't tell you. It was engineered for maximum psychological trauma and maximum bloodshed. The phalanx wasn't about clean, honorable combat. It was about pushing men into a meat grinder. The Greeks didn't have combat medics. They didn't have field hospitals. The Greek historian and soldier Xenophon describes phalanx combat in his Anabasis. When the lines meet, there is pushing with shields, striking, slaying, dying. That antiseptic phrase, pushing with shields, conceals the horror of othismos, the literal shoving match that occurred when phalanxes collided. Imagine, you're in the middle ranks of a phalanx, men in front of you, men behind you, men on both sides, all locked together by shields. The formation is so tight you can barely move. You can see the enemy approaching, their spears, their shields, their faces, and there's no escape. You can't retreat. Your own comrades are pressed behind you. You can't advance faster than the formation. You're trapped. Then the lines collide. The front ranks start stabbing with spears, not at armored chests, but at faces, necks, groins, any exposed flesh. Men fall screaming. The ranks behind them step over their bodies, sometimes on their bodies, and keep pushing. The whole formation becomes a hydraulic press of human flesh, each side trying to break the other through sheer force. Victor Davis Hanson, in The Western Way of War, describes the sensory reality, the smell of blood, shit, and fierce sweat mixed together, the sound of bronze on bronze, screams of the wounded, orders being shouted over the din, the sight of men's faces being caved in by spear butts, eyes gouged out, teeth broken, the feeling of being trapped, unable to run, forced to kill or be killed, and it went on for hours. Phalanx battles weren't quick. Men stood in formation, stabbing and pushing, until one side's nerve broke and they ran. That's when the real slaughter began. Greek warfare had a term for the pursuit after a phalanx broke. Diagmos, the chase. When one phalanx broke and ran, the victorious side would drop formation and chase them down. Running men, dropping shields and weapons, were speared in the back, clubbed with spear butts, trampled. The rules of combat ended when the formation broke. The casualties tell the story. At Leoctra, 371 BCE, the Thebans killed 1,000 Spartans in the battle itself, but during the rout, the numbers exploded. At Plataea, 479 BCE, the Persian casualties were estimated at 50,000 or more, most killed during the pursuit. And here's what makes it darker. This was considered glorious. This was a ret, virtue, excellence, courage. Young men were raised to aspire to die in the phalanx. The phalanx wasn't a shield wall for defense. It was an efficient machine for killing and traumatizing the maximum number of men, while maintaining enough psychological pressure that your own soldiers couldn't flee. It turned warfare into a nightmare of enforced proximity violence. and it dominated Mediterranean warfare for 400 years. Darkness. Absolute darkness. You're 300 feet underground in the Lorien mines, southeast of Athens. The shaft is barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The air is thick with rock dust that coats your lungs. The temperature is sweltering from thousands of bodies packed into the tunnels. You're chained to the wall by your ankle. You've been here for 8 hours already. You have 4 more to go before they pull you up. If they pull you up. This is where Athens got the silver that paid for the Parthenon. This is where democracy got its funding. Here's the reality of Greek slavery that gets glossed over. Ancient Athens, that beacon of civilization, built its golden age on the backs of perhaps 20,000, 30,000 slaves working in the silver mines at Lorien. Not domestic servants, not agricultural workers, industrial miners working in conditions that would make modern human rights organizations weep. The archaeological evidence from Lorien is extensive. Thousands of mine shafts, some over 100 meters deep, honeycomb the hills. The tunnels are narrow, often just 60, 70 centimeters wide, because they were dug by human hands, by slaves working in cramped positions with hand tools. No ventilation systems, no safety supports, just stone, tools, and expendable humans. The mining process worked like this. Slaves would be lowered into the shafts at dawn. They would spend 12-hour shifts hammering at the rock face with iron chisels and picks, extracting silver-bearing ore. The ore was hauled up in baskets by other slaves. The work was done by lamplight, tiny oil lamps that consume what little oxygen existed in the tunnels. Cave-ins were common. Flooding was frequent. Escape was impossible. Many slaves were literally chained to the rock face while they worked. The historian Xenophon wrote a treatise called Poroi, on revenues, where he discusses Lorien's profitability. He mentions casually that Athens could increase its revenue by buying more slaves for the mines. He treats them as livestock, units of production whose deaths could be offset by purchasing replacements. Inscriptions from Athens record slave prices. Mining slaves were cheaper than domestic or skilled slaves because their life expectancy was so short. Why pay premium prices for slaves who'd be dead within a few years? The orator Hyperides, in a 4th century BCE speech, mentions a mining operation owned by a man named Diphilus, who employed 1,000 slaves. The casualness of the number is striking. 1,000 humans owned by one man, their lives spent in darkness. Archaeological excavations have uncovered slave quarters near the mines. Windowless stone buildings, each room barely large enough to lie down, designed to house dozens of slaves. No cooking facilities, minimal sanitation. These weren't living spaces. They were holding pens between shifts. The remains of the slaves themselves tell the story. Skeletal analysis of bodies found near Lorien show extreme physical trauma. Damaged spines from carrying heavy loads, deformed joints from repetitive motions, silicosis scarring in lungs from rock dust, healed fractures that were never properly set. Their bones record the systematic destruction of their bodies. But here's the darkest part. This wasn't hidden or controversial. The Lorien mines were public knowledge. Wealthy Athenians owned shares in mining operations. Philosophers debated politics while walking past slave markets that supplied the mines. Pericles' funeral oration. Our Constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people, was delivered in a city whose economy ran on industrial slavery. Athens built its golden age on silver, extracted by slaves dying in the dark. Let's return to the babies, because the pattern gets darker. 1930s, Athens. American archaeologists excavating the ancient agora, the marketplace and civic center of classical Athens, start uncovering wells. Ancient wells used for drinking water, later filled in and forgotten. Standard archaeology. Until they start finding the bones. Well J 2.4, excavated in 1937. Date, late 2nd century BCE. Contents, pottery fragments, household debris, and the remains of at least 450 infants, 450 babies, in one well, not buried, not in a cemetery, thrown down a well like garbage. The initial report, published by the American School of Classical Studies, tried to find alternative explanations. Maybe it was a plague. But plague doesn't selectively kill only newborns. maybe a cemetery that got disturbed, but the bones showed no signs of burial. They were just dumped. Maybe stillbirths? But 450 stillbirths in one location suggests something more systematic. The pattern continued. Well, M21, another concentration of infant remains. Well, L21.1, same story. Across the Agora excavations, archaeologists found numerous deposits of newborn bones in domestic refuse contexts. Wells, cisterns, trash pits. Bioarchaeologist Maria Liston analyzed the remains in detail in a 2012 study. The bones were almost exclusively newborns, less than a week old. No signs of disease, no signs of trauma, no signs of burial ritual. They had been simply discarded. But here's what makes it more disturbing. These wells were in residential areas. This wasn't a centralized disposal site. These were individual families throwing away babies in their own domestic water sources, so common that it didn't even rate special disposal methods, so accepted that nobody questioned throwing an infant's body into a well they'd later draw water from. Liston's study concluded what the evidence suggested: widespread, systematic infanticide through exposure, with the bodies disposed of as household refuse. And remember, this is Athens, the democratic Athens. The Athens of Plato and Aristotle. These wells date from the height of Athenian civilization, not some distant barbaric past. The playwright Posidippus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, has a character say, "A son one always raises even if one is poor. A daughter one exposes even if one is rich." He's not describing a rare practice. He's describing such a common occurrence that it's a throwaway line in a comedy. But the wells tell us something the texts don't: the sheer scale. We're not talking about rare, desperate acts. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of infants discarded in a single city over a couple of centuries, multiplied across dozens of Greek cities over 1,000 years. Do the math. It's staggering. And it wasn't hidden. The wells were in the agora, the literal center of public life. People knew. Everyone knew. Philosophers discussed the ethics of exposure in the abstract while walking past wells containing infant remains. Politicians debated child-rearing laws while disposing of unwanted daughters. Playwrights used exposure as plot devices because audiences found it relatable. The systematic nature of it is what's horrifying. This wasn't a dark secret. It was policy, infrastructure, a solution to the problem of unwanted children administered at the household level, so normalized that it required no special justification. The wells of the Agora hold the bones of Athens' unwanted children. Tourist maps mark the Agora's temples, its monuments, its civic buildings. They don't mark the wells, but the bones are still there, silent testimony to the brutality beneath the marble. A gymnasium in Athens mid-afternoon. Teenage boys, naked and oiled, grapple on the sand. This looks like wrestling practice. It is, until one boy's arm bends backward at an unnatural angle with an audible crack. The trainer nods approvingly. The boy doesn't cry out. He's been taught that pain is weakness, and weakness is death. This is Greek education. This is paideia. Here's what the gymnasiums actually were: state-sponsored training facilities where boys as young as 12 were subjected to years of systematic physical conditioning, designed to make them capable of standing in a phalanx and not fleeing when their friends were being killed next to them. The violence was the point. Wrestling, Greek wrestling, not modern Olympic wrestling, had almost no rules. You won by forcing your opponent's back to touch the ground 3 times. How you accomplished that didn't matter. Breaking fingers was common. Strangulation was allowed until the 5th century BCE. Gouging eyes was prohibited, but barely. Plato's Laches dialogue describes training exercises where boys practiced with actual weapons. Not wooden swords, actual bronze and iron. Injuries were expected. The dialogue discusses whether teaching boys to fight in armor is useful. They don't discuss whether teaching children to kill is ethical. That's assumed. The pankration, a gymnasium sport that combined wrestling and boxing, was even more brutal. Almost anything went. Strikes, kicks, throws, joint locks, choke holds. You won by submission or knockout. The only prohibited moves were biting and eye gouging, and even those rules were sometimes ignored. Men died in pankration matches. Regularly, one famous pancratiast, Eurychion of Phegalia, won the Olympic championship in 564 BCE by strangling his opponent while dying from a broken neck. His opponent tapped out a split second before Archeon died. They crowned the corpse. This was considered inspirational, but the gymnasiums weren't just about physical violence. They were about systematic breaking and remaking. Boys were removed from their mother's care at age 7 and placed under the supervision of male trainers. Spartan boys entered the agoge, the state training system, where they were deliberately underfed, forced to fight each other for food, and beaten regularly to teach endurance. Plutarch describes a Spartan boy who stole a fox cub and hid it under his cloak. When he was questioned, the fox began tearing into his stomach with its claws. The boy stood there, expressionless, allowing the fox to rip his intestines rather than admit the theft. He died from the wounds. The Spartans celebrated this as exemplary behavior. This wasn't an isolated incident. Plutarch presents it as typical of Spartan education. Boys were taught that physical agony was preferable to showing weakness. They were systematically traumatized into compliance. The sexual dimension of gymnasium culture adds another layer of darkness. Greek pederasty, the institutionalized relationships between adult men and adolescent boys, was centered in the gymnasium. These weren't romances. They were power relationships, often coercive, euphemized as mentorship. The orator Aeschines, prosecuting a case in 346 BCE, describes laws regulating when adult men could enter gymnasiums, not to prevent pederastic relationships, but to regulate them. The concern wasn't protecting boys from exploitation. It was ensuring proper social protocols were followed. But here's the thing. This worked. This systematic violence produced men capable of standing in a phalanx, capable of watching friends die, capable of killing without hesitation. The Spartans at Thermopylae who held the pass until they were slaughtered, products of this system. The Theban sacred band who fought to the last man at Chaeronea, products of this system. Greek education wasn't about enlightenment or individual flourishing. It was about manufacturing soldiers. The gymnasiums were factories where boys entered and traumatized. Obedient warriors emerged. Aegospotami, 405 BCE. The Athenian fleet, 160 ships carrying roughly 30,000 men, has been destroyed by Sparta. The Spartans have taken thousands of prisoners, Athenian sailors, and soldiers who surrendered expecting the usual ransom negotiations. Instead, the Spartan general Lysander lines them up on the beach and has them all executed. 3,000 men. Maybe 4,000. The sources disagree on the exact number, but they agree on the massacre. Every single prisoner. Killed. This was legal. This was normal. This was how Greeks treated Greeks. Here's what doesn't make it into the sanitized versions of Greek warfare. Prisoners had no rights. The Geneva Conventions are a modern invention. In ancient Greece, captured enemies belonged to their captors absolutely. They could be ransomed, enslaved, or executed at whim. Execution was common. After Marathon, 490 BCE, the Athenians captured 6,400 Persian sailors. They killed them all, not in the heat of battle, but after the fighting ended, in cold blood. After Plataea, 479 BCE, the Greeks massacred Persian prisoners by the thousands. After Mycale, same story. But it's the Greek-on-Greek violence that's most revealing. These weren't civilized Greeks fighting barbaric foreigners. These were citizens of democratic city-states slaughtering citizens of other democratic city-states. When Athens captured the island of Skyone in 421 BCE, the assembly voted on what to do with the prisoners. The debate wasn't whether to kill them, that was assumed, but whether to kill just the men or include the women and children. They settled on killing all the men and enslaving everyone else. The historian Thucydides records this as an unremarkable event. The orator Demosthenes, in a speech from 340 BCE, casually mentions that Philip of Macedon sold 10,000 prisoners into slavery after capturing Olynthus. He's not criticizing Philip for this. He's criticizing him for not ransoming them, which would have been more profitable for Philip. Slavery was often seen as mercy. At least slaves were alive. Many prisoners would have preferred execution to what awaited them. Consider the Athenian navy's treatment of captured pirates. Pirates, who preyed on Greek shipping, were subjected to apotympanismos. They were tied to a board, beaten with clubs until their bones broke, and then left in public squares to die slowly over days. This wasn't judicial punishment hidden away. It was public spectacle, entertainment for passing citizens. The practice was so common, there was specialized vocabulary for it. Andrapadismos, the enslavement of entire populations. Diagmos, the massacre of fleeing enemies. Apotympanismos, execution by clubbing. These weren't euphemisms, they were standard military terminology. But perhaps the darkest aspect was the systematic nature of it. City-states had established procedures for handling prisoners. Courts would debate the fate of captured populations. Assemblies would vote on massacres. It wasn't chaos or bloodlust, it was bureaucratic violence. After the Battle of Arginusae, 406 BCE, Athens executed 6 of its own generals, not for losing the battle, they won, but for failing to recover the bodies of dead Athenian sailors due to a storm. The generals were tried, convicted, and executed as a group. Socrates, serving in the assembly that day, was the only member to vote against the illegal group trial. He was overruled. A year later, Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans, who could have executed the entire Athenian assembly for war crimes, as Athens had done to others, instead installed the 30 tyrants, a puppet government that promptly executed 1,500 Athenian citizens. The cycle of violence was systemic. Every city-state did it. Every war produced massacres. Every conflict ended with executions or enslavements. The prisoners at Aegospotami died because they expected ransom. They expected negotiations. They were wrong. Lysander had them all killed, and Sparta celebrated him as a hero. The beach at Aegospotami is a quiet place now. There's no monument, no memorial. The bones are long gone, but the pattern remains. Athens, 430 BCE. A wealthy woman sits in the gynekonitis, the women's quarters, of her husband's house. She's 23 years old, married since she was 14, mother of 3 children. She's spent the last 9 years in this house and is not allowed to leave without a male escort. She cannot own property. She cannot vote. She cannot testify in court. She cannot divorce her husband. Under Athenian law, she is legally equivalent to a child. She will remain so until she dies. This is democracy. For half the population, it meant nothing. Here's the reality of women's lives in classical Greece that gets sanitized. Women, even free-born Athenian women from citizen families, had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't own property, inherit, or control their own dowries. They couldn't make contracts above trivial values. They couldn't initiate legal proceedings. In every legal sense, they were perpetual minors, controlled first by their fathers, then by their husbands, then by their sons. The legal term was kyrios, guardian. Every woman, regardless of age or status, required a male guardian to conduct any legal business. Even wealthy widows, even women running their deceased husbands' estates, technically needed a male representative. The orator Demosthenes summarizes Athenian views bluntly. We have courtesans for pleasure, concubines for daily physical use, and wives to bear legitimate children and be faithful guardians of our households. Women are categorized by their sexual utility to men, that's it. But the physical confinement was even more restrictive. Respectable Athenian women were expected to remain in the gynekonitis, separate quarters and houses where they spent their entire lives. They could emerge for religious festivals, certain ones, and family occasions, always accompanied by male relatives. Otherwise, they were housebound. Xenophon's Economicus describes the ideal marriage. A man marries a 14-year-old girl who had been brought up to see and hear as little as possible and ask the fewest questions. He then trains her, like a dog, to manage the household according to his instructions. Xenophon presents this as aspirational, not dystopian. The age gap was systematic. Men married in their late 20s or early 30s after military service. Girls were married at 14, 15, immediately after puberty. The average age gap was 15 years. The power dynamic was total, husband as father figure, woman as child wife, and divorce was unilateral. A man could divorce his wife at any time, for any reason, by simply declaring the marriage over. He kept the children, who were legally his property, returned her dowry, and sent her back to her father's house. The woman had no say. A woman could theoretically seek divorce, but only through her male guardian petitioning on her behalf, and only for specific causes, usually severe abuse. Even then, social stigma made it nearly impossible. Divorced women were marked as shameful. Let's talk about inheritance. Athenian. Law allowed daughters to inherit only if there were no sons. But even then, the inheritance didn't belong to them. They came with it like accessories. The nearest male relative would be required to marry the heiress, epikleros, to keep the property in the family line. The woman was a vessel for property transfer, nothing more. The sexual double standard was codified in law. A husband who caught his wife in adultery could legally kill her lover on the spot, no trial needed. The wife would typically be divorced and disgraced, but not killed. But husbands were expected to have extramarital affairs. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed. Men visiting brothels or keeping concubines was standard. A wife objecting would be seen as unreasonable. The philosopher Aristotle wrote in his Politics, "The male is by nature superior, and the female inferior, and the one rules, and the other is ruled." He continues, "A woman is, as it were, an infertile male. Women have deliberative faculty, but it lacks authority." So, when we celebrate Athens as the birthplace of democracy, remember, democracy for 10 to 15% of the population, adult male citizens, tyranny for the rest. Olympia, 564 BCE. The stadium is packed. 20,000 spectators watch as two men circle each other in the pancration final, the most brutal event in the games. One fighter, Artemis of Phygalia, is defending his title. His opponent has him in a chokehold from behind. Artemis can't breathe. His vision is darkening. In seconds, he'll lose consciousness. He reaches back, grabs his opponent's foot, and breaks the ankle with a savage twist. The opponent screams and signals submission, tapping out. Artemis dies from the chokehold a moment later. His corpse is crowned Olympic champion. The crowd goes wild. This is glory. Here's what the Olympics actually were: a religious festival featuring sanctioned violence where men regularly died, where cheating was punished more severely than murder, and where victory mattered more than survival. The Olympic Games weren't about sportsmanship or athletic excellence in the modern sense. They were about arete, violent physical dominance that proved the gods' favor. Winning wasn't enough. You had to break your opponent. Boxing matches had no rounds, no weight classes, no time limits. Fighters wrapped their hands in leather straps studded with metal, the himantes, and pounded each other until one man couldn't continue. Ears were ripped off, noses broken, teeth shattered, eye sockets crushed. You fought until someone quit or died. The boxer Diagoras of Rhodes reportedly killed his opponent in the Olympic finals. He was celebrated for it. His victory was considered so glorious that the poet Pindar composed an ode. 3 of his grandsons also won Olympic boxing titles. It was a family legacy of sanctioned violence. The pancration was worse. Almost no rules, just no biting, no eye gouging. Everything else, joint breaks, chokeholds, strikes to the genitals, kicks to the head of a downed opponent, was legal. Men died regularly. One fighter, Cleomedes of Astypalia, apparently went mad during a match and killed his opponent by cracking his ribs. The judges disqualified him, not for the killing, but for fighting while insane, which violated the sound mind requirement. But the death toll was just background noise. What's darker is how the games reflected Greek values. Only freeborn Greek males could compete. No slaves, no foreigners, no women. Women couldn't even attend as spectators, on penalty of death. One woman, Calipatera, disguised herself as a male trainer to watch her son compete. When he won, she leaped a barrier in excitement, and her disguise was revealed. The officials nearly executed her, but relented because her father, brothers, and son were all Olympic champions. The punishment for female spectators being caught was explicit. They were to be thrown off Mount Typeum. This wasn't theoretical, it was codified law. Victory brought godlike status. Olympic champions were treated as living embodiments of divine favor. They received cash prizes, lifetime pensions, front row seats at theaters, free meals for life, and exemption from taxes. Statues were erected, odes composed. They became walking proof that the gods blessed their cities. Defeat brought shame. Losing in Olympic finals was so disgraceful that some athletes committed suicide rather than return home. Others went into exile. The poet Pindar records the fate of losers. They slink through back alleys, avoiding their enemies. And cheating? Cheating was punished more harshly than killing your opponent. If you were caught bribing opponents or officials, your city was fined enormous sums. Bronze statues called zanes were erected on the path to the stadium, inscribed with your name and offense, funded by the fines. These statues stood for centuries as monuments to shame. One boxer, Eupolis of Thessaly, was caught bribing his opponents in 388 BCE. 6 zanes were erected, 1 for him and 5 for the boxers he bribed. The inscriptions read, "An Olympic victory is to be won, not by money, but by swiftness of foot and strength of body." The hypocrisy is staggering. Death in competition, glorious, permanent injury, expected. But taking money, unforgivable. The ancient Olympics were religious festivals celebrating controlled violence, where death was acceptable, women were banned on penalty of death, and victory mattered more than life. Athens, 404 BCE. The Peloponnesian War is over. Athens has lost. The long walls are demolished. The fleet is destroyed. And now, in the assembly, exhausted Athenian citizens are voting on a proposal from the victorious Spartans. Install a temporary government of 30 men to revise the laws. The vote passes. Democracy votes itself out of existence. What happens next is one of the darkest chapters in Athenian history, and Athens did it to itself. The 30 tyrants, led by Critias and Ceremonies, took power in 404 BCE. They were supposed to reform the constitution. Instead, they launched a reign of terror that would have made Stalin proud. First, they purged the sycophants, the professional prosecutors who had made careers out of bringing politically motivated lawsuits. Fair enough, except they defined sycophant as anyone we don't like. Dozens were executed without trial in the first weeks. Then they moved to the metics, the foreign residents of Athens. The 30 declared that metics were inherently disloyal and needed to be controlled. They arrested the wealthiest metics, executed them, and confiscated their property. The philosopher Lysias barely escaped. His brother Polemarchus was arrested, forced to drink hemlock, and denied even burial rites. His property was seized before his body was cold. The orator Lysias, in his Against Eratosthenes, describes what happened. They did not even allow his relatives to carry out the body from the house, but they hired bearers and furnished a bier. They took 3 talents from the house and 700 gold staters. They took silver and gold jewelry and furniture such as they never thought they would possess. But the metics were just the beginning. The 30 expanded their definition of enemies of the state to include anyone with money, anyone who had opposed them politically, anyone they didn't trust. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need trials. They had power. Xenophon, in his Hellenica, describes the systematic murder. They put to death those who made their living by informing, and those who curried favor with the democracy at the expense of good citizens. At first, the council supported these measures, and so did those citizens who were not implicated, but when the 30 began to consider whom they could safely put to death, they cast their eyes on the wealthy. Within 8 months, the 30 tyrants executed approximately 500 Athenian citizens and metics. That's 5 people per day, every day for 8 months. In a city of perhaps 30,000 citizens, that's 5% of the population murdered by their own government. And these weren't battlefield deaths or casualties of war. These were neighbors executed by neighbors, philosophers killed by philosophers. The 30 were educated men. Critias had been a student of Socrates. Ceremonies was a respected politician. These weren't barbarians. They were products of Athenian democracy turning democracy's tools against itself. Their method was efficient. Arrest, summary execution, confiscation of property, no trials, no appeals, no records. People simply disappeared. The property seizures funded the regime. The 30 weren't just tyrannical, they were a self-financing murder machine. Critias himself outlined the philosophy in a speech Xenophon records. If any of you suppose that more people are dying than the situation demands, remember that wherever there is a change of government, these things occur. And those who seek to make this government stable must necessarily have the most enemies here at Athens, because it is the most populous of Greek cities. Translation: we're killing people to maintain power, and we're killing lots of people because Athens is big. That's the justification. Naked power politics dressed in pragmatism. But here's what makes it darkest. Athens supported them at first. The 30 initially had popular support among the wealthy and conservative citizens who were tired of democratic excess, tired of demagogues, tired of mob rule. They saw the 30 as bringing order. Only when the executions expanded to include anyone with property, when the wealthy realized they were targets too, did resistance form. By then, 1,500 were dead. The 30 tyrants revealed something fundamental about democracy. It can vote itself into tyranny. Democracy votes itself out of existence. The island of Delos, mid-2nd century BCE. The harbor is crowded with ships. The marketplace, one of the ancient world's largest slave markets, is packed with human merchandise. On a good day, 10,000 slaves change hands here. 10,000 human beings bought and sold in a single day. The efficiency is what's horrifying. Here's what slave markets actually looked like. Strabo, the geographer writing in the 1st century BCE, describes Delos. The island could admit and send away tens of thousands of slaves in the same day. The cause of this was the wealth of the Romans after they became prosperous and used many slaves, and the destruction of Carthage. 10,000 slaves per day. Let that sink in. That's not a metaphor. That's documented capacity. The market infrastructure, the pens, the platforms, the inspection areas, the processing facilities, was designed to handle industrial-scale human trafficking. The process was systematic. Captured populations from wars, kidnapping victims from pirate raids, children sold by desperately poor families, debt slaves. They all flowed through markets like Delos, like cattle through an abattoir. Plutarch describes the market procedures. Slaves were displayed naked on rotating platforms. Buyers would inspect them like livestock, checking teeth, examining muscles, testing reflexes. Male slaves were examined for physical strength and working capacity. Female slaves were examined for reproductive potential and sexual attractiveness. Children were assessed for training potential. Each slave wore a placard listing their origin, age, skills, and any defects. The language is commercial. Syrian male, 23 years, knows carpentry, missing 2 toes. Thracian female, 16 years, virgin, suitable for domestic service. Galatian male, 30 years, strong back, brand on shoulder indicates previous escape attempt. That last detail, brands for escaped slaves, was standard practice. Recaptured runaways were branded on the forehead with letters indicating they'd fled, fugue, fugitivis in Roman practice. Similar Greek branding existed. The brand was permanent, visible, designed to prevent future escapes by making the slave's status immediately obvious. The pricing structure reveals Greek values. Skilled slaves, artisans, scribes, tutors commanded premium prices, often 300-500 drachmas. Healthy agricultural workers cost 150 and 300 drachmas. Unskilled laborers, 100 nalm, 200 drachmas. Young, attractive women for domestic or sexual service could cost 200-600 drachmas, depending on appearance. Children were cheaper, 50-150 drachmas, but considered good investments if trained young. For comparison, a skilled worker's daily wage was about 1 drachma. An unskilled slave cost roughly 100 days of wages, cheaper than a horse, about the same as quality furniture. But the psychology of the markets is what's most disturbing. These weren't hidden, shameful transactions. They were public, commercial, mundane. Respectable citizens shopped for slaves the way modern people shop for cars, comparing features, negotiating prices, discussing maintenance costs. Xenophon wrote a treatise, Ways and Means, discussing how Athens could increase revenue by purchasing slaves for the Laurion silver mines. He analyzes it as a business opportunity. It is clear to everyone that if a sufficient number of slaves were purchased to provide the mines with 3 slaves per Athenian citizen, the revenue would be greatly increased. 3 slaves per citizen, as casually as discussing farming equipment. Aristotle provided the philosophical justification in his Politics. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. It is clear that some men are by nature free, and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right. Some people are natural slaves. That's not ancient barbarians speaking. That's one of humanity's greatest philosophers, providing intellectual cover for human trafficking. The slave markets had specialized sections. The beautiful children section where young slaves were sold for sexual purposes, euphemistically called personal service. The defective section where injured or sick slaves were sold at discount prices. The exotic section where unusual slaves, Ethiopians, Scythians, Indians, commanded premium prices as status symbols. And the volume was staggering. After Alexander the Great's conquest of Thebes in 335 BCE, he sold 30,000 survivors into slavery in a single mass sale. After the Roman conquest of Epirus in 167 BCE, 150,000 Greeks were enslaved in one day. The markets absorbed these massive influxes without collapsing. The island of Delos is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Guidebooks mention it was a major commercial center. The rotating platforms where naked humans were displayed, they don't mention those. Melis, 417 BCE. The Athenian general receives his orders from the assembly. The people of Melis, Athenian allies who paid tribute, who sent soldiers to Athenian wars, have been accused of disloyalty. The order is simple: kill every male past adolescence. Enslave the women and children. This isn't an enemy population. These are allies. Their crime? Athens suspected they might rebel. The closest documented parallel is Scione, 421 BCE. Scione had rebelled against Athens, but had surrendered before Athens voted on its fate. The war was over, but the demagogue Cleon convinced the assembly that mercy was weakness. The vote: execute all men, enslave all women and children. Thucydides records it with weary horror. The Athenians executed all the adult males of Scione whom they captured, enslaved the women and children, and gave the land to the Plataeans to inhabit. All of them. An entire city's male population, executed after surrender, not in battle, in cold blood, by democratic vote. Consider the pattern: 427 BCE, Mytilene rebels. Athens votes to execute all men, enslave all women and children. They send a ship with the orders. The next day, a second vote narrowly reverses the decision. A second ship races to overtake the first and arrives just in time. About 1,000 Mytilenean leaders are executed anyway. Democracy's merciful compromise. 521 BCE, Scione rebels. Entire male population executed after the war ends. 416 BCE, Melos refuses to join Athens. Entire male population executed, women and children enslaved. 413 BCE, after Athens' catastrophic defeat in Sicily, Syracusans throw 7,000 Athenian prisoners into stone quarries where they die slowly. When Athens hears of this, their reaction isn't horror at the war crime. It's anger that their enemies dared treat Athenians the way Athens treated others. The Athenian Empire maintained control through systematic threat of annihilation. Step out of line, and we'll vote to exterminate you. It was an empty threat. Athens proved repeatedly they'd do it. But here's what makes it darker than simple conquest. These were democratic decisions. The assembly debated them. Citizens heard arguments pro and con. Votes were taken. Majorities approved genocide. In the Mytilenean debate, Cleon argued for total extermination on pragmatic grounds. Your empire is a tyranny, held over subjects who plot against you. They don't obey you from goodwill, but from force. Show mercy once, and every subject city will rebel. The counter-argument from Diodotus wasn't moral, it was practical. Executing everyone is bad policy because it guarantees desperate resistance. Better to execute only the leaders and spare the population. Notice, neither side argued that genocide was wrong. They debated whether it was effective policy. This is Athens, democratic Athens, Socratic Athens. The Athens that gave us philosophy, tragedy, and political theory, voting on whether to exterminate entire populations. And they did it repeatedly, systematically, with full public support. The demagogues played to fear. Cleon, Hyperbolus, later Cleophon, they built careers on advocating harsh measures against subject cities. They whipped up assembly fears. Show weakness and the empire collapses. They'll all rebel. Athens will fall. And it worked. Fear overrode morality every time. until Athens lost, until Syracuse threw Athenian prisoners into quarries, until Sparta besieged Athens and brought democracy to its knees, until the 30 tyrants took power and turned Athens' imperial tactics inward, executing 1,500 citizens in 8 months. The pattern Athens established came home. The logic Athens used to justify exterminating allied populations, might makes right, the strong do what they will, was used against Athens itself, and Athens couldn't appeal to justice or morality because Athens had explicitly rejected those principles in the Melian dialogue. The Athenians even had a name for this strategy: andropodismos, the enslavement of an entire population after conquest. It was standard military policy. The democracy that gave us philosophy also gave us systematic genocide as state policy. The ruins of Melos are still visible. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of the siege and destruction, but you won't find memorials to the dead. The Melians were wiped from history as thoroughly as they were wiped from life. Democracy did this. The people voted for genocide, and the generals carried it out. A hillside outside Plataea, 479 BCE. The battle is over. The Greeks have won a decisive victory over the Persians. The field is littered with bodies, but not all of them are corpses. Hundreds, maybe thousands of wounded men lie among the dead. They're moaning, crying out for water, for help, for mercy. The Greek army packs up and marches away. The wounded are left behind. This isn't negligence. This is policy. Here's what ancient sources rarely emphasize but consistently show. Ancient warfare had no medical evacuation, no battlefield medicine, no concept of treating wounded enemy soldiers. If you were wounded and couldn't walk, you were left to die. If you were enemy wounded, you might be killed outright. The Greeks didn't have combat medics. They didn't have field hospitals. They had camp followers, slaves and servants who might treat wounded soldiers back in camp. But on the battlefield, you were on your own. Herodotus describes the aftermath of battles with clinical detachment. The wounded who could walk made it to camp. Those who couldn't, didn't. Simple as that. The ones left behind died of blood loss, dehydration, exposure, or were finished off by scavengers, human and animal. But it's worse than simple lack of medical infrastructure. The Greeks had an active policy against helping enemy wounded. After Plataea, the Spartans systematically hunted down Persian wounded hiding in the woods, not taking prisoners, killing them. Herodotus mentions it casually. Those who had hidden themselves were discovered and slain. The same pattern after Marathon. Persian wounded along the beach, unable to retreat to their ships, were killed by pursuing Greeks. The battle itself killed perhaps 6,400 Persians. The slaughter of the wounded and fleeing added thousands more. This was standard practice. When a phalanx broke and routed, the pursuit, diagmos, involved killing fleeing and wounded men. It wasn't considered cowardly or dishonorable. It was finishing the job. But the treatment of Greek wounded by other Greeks is even more revealing. Spartan law reportedly required wounded soldiers to return with their shields or on them. Either with it or on it was the phrase supposedly spoken by Spartan mothers to sons going to war. A man who lost his shield had dropped it to flee and was a coward. A man carried on his shield was dead and died honorably. But a man wounded and unable to continue fighting, ambiguous at best. Xenophon describes the aftermath of a skirmish in his Anabasis. The wounded were left in the nearest village with a guard detail. That sounds humane until you realize left means abandoned. The guards weren't medical personnel. They were there to prevent the wounded from being captured and interrogated, not to provide care. When Xenophon's 10,000 marched through Persian territory, wounded who couldn't keep up were left behind. The text doesn't dwell on their fate, but it's implicit. They were either enslaved, killed, or died. Of their wounds, the army couldn't afford to slow down. The Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BCE, includes a detail that gets sanitized in retellings. Leonidas sent away the wounded before the final stand. They weren't allowed to die gloriously with the 300. They were evacuated as liabilities. The wounded Spartan Aristodemus made it home and was treated with disgrace for surviving. He had to redeem himself by dying in the next battle. Survival with wounds was shameful. Death was glorious. That was the value system. Greek city-states had no veterans' benefits, no disability pensions, no support systems. A hoplite who lost an arm in battle and could no longer work was expected to rely on family charity. If he had no family, begging. Athens in the late 5th century BCE instituted a small pension for disabled veterans, 1 obol per day, barely enough to survive. The fact that this was considered progressive shows how little support existed previously. Disabled veterans became a visible underclass in Greek cities, men begging on street corners, displaying their wounds to earn sympathy. The playwright Aristophanes references them in comedies, usually as comic relief. Ancient battlefield medicine can be summed up. If you could walk, you might live. If you couldn't, you wouldn't. The wounded soldiers left on the hillside after Plataea, they weren't forgotten. They were abandoned deliberately, as policy. Syracuse, 413 BCE. The harbor is packed with wrecked Athenian ships. On the shore, 7,000 Athenian soldiers, what's left of the greatest military expedition Athens ever launched, are surrendering to the Syracusans. They're exhausted, starving, broken. They expect prisoner negotiations, ransoms, the usual protocols. Instead, the Syracusans march them to stone quarries and seal them inside. This is the catastrophic end of the Sicilian expedition. Athens' attempt to conquer Sicily, which turned into one of ancient warfare's greatest disasters. But the story doesn't start with defeat. It starts with Athens attempting exactly what Syracuse eventually did to them. 415 BCE, Athens is at an uneasy truce with Sparta. The city should be rebuilding, recovering. Instead, the demagogue Alcibiades convinces the assembly to invade Sicily, a massive island far from Greece, with wealthy cities and no direct threat to Athens. The rationale is nakedly imperialistic. Sicily is rich. Conquering it will make Athens richer. And if we don't conquer it, our enemies might. That's it. No defensive war, no retaliation for attacks. Just, they have wealth, we want it. The assembly debates. The older conservative politicians like Nicias argue it's insanity, overextension, too risky, too far from home. Alcibiades and the young firebrands argue for glory and profit. Democracy votes for war. The largest military expedition Athens ever assembled, over 100 warships, 5,000 hoplites, thousands of support personnel, set sail for Sicily in the summer of 415 BCE. Thucydides describes the departure. The whole city came down to the Piraeus to see them off. The spectacle was magnificent. Yet at the same time, the risk was terrifying to contemplate when they considered the long voyage and the uncertainty of the campaign. The expedition was doomed from the start. Alcibiades was recalled to Athens on charges of religious impiety. He'd allegedly mutilated Hermes and profaned the Eleusinian mysteries. He fled to Sparta and defected, advising Athens' enemies on how to beat Athens. The Athenian siege of Syracuse dragged on for 2 years. Athenian reinforcements arrived, more ships, more soldiers. Athens poured resources into Sicily, while Sparta, advised by Alcibiades, fortified Deceleia in Attica, giving Athens a permanent enemy garrison on its doorstep. By 413 BCE, everything was falling apart. The Athenian fleet was trapped in Syracuse harbor. A desperate attempt to break out failed. The land army tried to retreat inland and was hunted down by Syracusan cavalry. Thucydides describes the retreat with devastating clarity. They were harassed on all sides by the enemy's light troops. The men were suffering from want of food and water, yet they could not stop to get either. The wounded and sick who could not keep up were left behind, crying out to their comrades not to abandon them. The Athenian general Nicias tried to surrender on terms. Syracuse refused. The Syracusans wanted that revenge, not negotiation. The captured Athenians and their allies, 7,000 men, were imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse. These weren't prisons. They were open-air pits, carved into rock, exposed to the sun. No shade, no shelter. Minimal food and water. Thucydides describes it. They were confined in the quarries, where, crowded together in a narrow space, they suffered at first from the heat of the sun and the closeness of the air. Then came the cold autumn nights, and the change of temperature caused disease among them. They were compelled to do everything in the same place for lack of space. The corpses of those who died from their wounds, from disease, and from the change of temperature were piled on top of one another. The stench was intolerable. The Syracusans gave each prisoner half a pint of water and a pint of grain per day. Survival rations. Barely. For 70 days, the Athenian prisoners lived in those conditions. Then the Syracusans started selling them as slaves. The officers, including Nicias and his co-general Demosthenes, were executed. And here's the dark irony. This is exactly what Athens had been doing to other cities for decades. Syracuse applied Athens' own philosophy back to Athens. You can't spend decades saying, might makes right, and then appeal to mercy when you're weak. Syracuse learned from Athens, and applied the lesson perfectly. Athens, during the Thargelia festival. A man is led through the streets. His head is crowned with dried figs and barley cakes. His clothing is tattered. The crowd jeers. Some throw garbage. Children mock him. He's paraded through each district of the city in a ritualized procession that ends at the city gates. Then he's expelled into the wilderness to die. This is the pharmakos, the human scapegoat, and it happened annually in Athens for centuries. Here's where Greek religion gets truly dark. The pharmakos ritual involves selecting individuals, usually criminals, the disabled, or the extremely poor, to bear the city's sins and pollution. They would be purified through ritual beating, then expelled or, in some accounts, killed. The evidence comes from multiple sources. The poet Hipponax, 6th century BCE, describes the practice. They let out 2 pharmakoi for purification, one for the men, one for the women. He later describes them being stoned to death. The lexicographer Helladius, 4th century CE, records, "At Athens they maintained at public expense certain individuals of lowest character for use in purifications. When any disaster befell the city, whether famine or plague or any other trouble, they led one of these individuals outside and slaughtered him as a purification and atonement for the city." The pharmakos wasn't condemned for a crime. He was selected for being expendable. His death or expulsion symbolically removed the city's miasma, spiritual pollution. Think about what this means. Athens, the democratic Athens, the philosophical Athens, institutionalized ritual scapegoating. The city maintained a pool of marginal individuals specifically to be sacrificed during crises. Some scholars argue the pharmakoi weren't actually killed, just expelled, beaten, and driven out. But the sources are mixed. Petronius mentions pharmakoi being stoned. Servius describes them being burned alive. Even if merely expelled, being driven into the wilderness without resources was a death sentence. And the selection criteria are telling. The ugly, the disabled, the poor, people whose lives were considered worthless. The ritual codified into religious practice the idea that some human lives mattered less than others. The ritual's structure reveals its purpose. The pharmakos would be beaten with fig branches and squills, a type of plant, particularly on the genitals, marking them as symbolically castrated, rendered ritually impotent. They were beaten 7 times, a sacred number, then driven out while the city celebrated their purification. The Thargelia festival, when this occurred, was a harvest festival honoring Apollo, the same Apollo worshipped as the god of reason, music, and prophecy, the god of the Delphic oracle, the god of civilization itself, and his worship included ritual scapegoating of disabled people. But Athens wasn't unique. The ritual existed throughout the Greek world with local variations. Marseille, ancient Massalia, maintained a pharmakos who was fed at public expense for a year before being expelled or sacrificed. The city literally raised a human for slaughter. The pharmakos practice reveals something fundamental about Greek religion. It wasn't just about honoring gods through offerings and prayers. It involved symbolic violence against humans designated as spiritually contaminated. And here's the darkest implication. The pharmakos ritual provided religious justification for viewing certain humans as disposable. If the city could ritually expel or kill marginal people to purify itself, why wouldn't it do so politically? The same Athens that practiced pharmakos rituals also practiced political ostracism, annual votes to exile citizens for 10 years. The same Athens that beat and expelled ritual scapegoats also voted to execute generals, exterminate allied populations, and abandon wounded soldiers. The pattern isn't coincidence. The religious practice normalized the political practice. If humans can be ritually sacrificed for the collective good, they can be politically sacrificed too. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben, analyzing the Pharmakos, argues it represents bare life, human existence stripped of political rights and protections, reducible to pure biological existence that can be killed without committing murder. The Pharmakos wasn't executed, he was expelled. His death in the wilderness wasn't murder because he was outside the police, outside the community, outside the protections of law. And once you create that category, humans who can be killed without murder, you can expand it. Political enemies become scapegoats. Allied cities become sacrifices. The ritual eventually died out, probably during the Hellenistic period, but its logic persisted. But for centuries, Athens, philosophical, democratic Athens, beat disabled people with sticks, drove them into the wilderness, and called it religious purification. The gods demanded it. The city obeyed. Let's return to those stone quarries in Syracuse, because the horror deserves more attention. The Latomi, the quarries, were carved into limestone hills outside Syracuse. They were mining operations during peacetime, extracting building stone. They became prisons during wartime, and they became mass graves during the Sicilian expedition. But the Athenian prisoners weren't the first to die there. Syracusans had been using the quarries as prisons for generations. The practice was established, efficient, cost-effective. Why build prisons when you have giant stone pits that serve the same purpose? Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, describes the conditions. The prisoners in the quarries suffered terribly. They received only a small ration of food and water. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day. At night, the cold was severe. They had no shelter, no sanitation. Disease spread rapidly. The stench of death was overwhelming. But here's what makes it darker. The quarries weren't just prisons. They were entertainment. Syracusan citizens would visit the quarries to mock the prisoners, to throw refuse at them, to watch them suffer. The quarries were tourist destinations. People brought their families. Think about what that means. Parents brought children to watch thousands of men dying slowly of dehydration, starvation, and disease. And this was considered normal recreation. The Athenian prisoners initially hoped for rescue. They didn't understand that Syracuse had abandoned any pretense of civilized warfare. The first days, they organized themselves, tried to maintain military discipline. Officers gave orders. Men shared rations. But there were no rations to share. The Syracusans deliberately provided just enough food to prolong death, not prevent it. Half a pint of water per day, in Mediterranean summer heat, in limestone quarries that reflected and amplified the sun. Men went mad with thirst. Thucydides records the descent. After a few days, all discipline broke down. Men turned on each other for scraps of food. The stronger robbed the weaker. Corpses piled up faster than they could be removed. The survivors were forced to live among the dead. 70 days of this. 10 weeks. The Syracusans waited until disease and starvation had done most of the work, then sold the survivors as slaves. The quarries were more cost-effective than execution. They generated revenue through slave sales while eliminating prisoners through neglect. But Syracuse's quarries weren't unique. They were just the most documented. Rome used the Tullianum, the Mamertine prison, as a dungeon where prisoners were strangled or left to starve. The Greek city-states had similar facilities. Prisoners weren't just killed. They were disposed of in ways that maximized suffering and minimized cost. The island of Gyaros became an exile destination where prisoners were sent to die. Tacitus describes it as a savage rock without inhabitants, without cultivation. Prisoners sent there usually died within months from exposure and starvation. But it wasn't execution. It was exile, legally distinct, practically identical. Athens had the Barathron, a pit into which condemned criminals were thrown. Some sources say it was execution by impact. Others say prisoners who survived the fall would slowly die of injuries, starvation, or thirst at the bottom. Either way, it was a stone pit used to dispose of humans. The pattern repeats across the Greek world. Stone pits, natural caves, abandoned quarries, all repurposed as prisons and execution sites. And the legal framework supported it. Prisoners of war belonged to their captors absolutely. City-states had no obligation to feed, house, or humanely treat captives. Killing them was permitted. Enslaving them was profitable. Letting them die slowly of neglect was cheapest. Economic incentives aligned with brutality. Some prisoners chose suicide. The Athenian general Nicias, captured at Syracuse, was executed relatively quickly, a mercy compared to the quarries. His soldiers weren't so lucky. Some smashed their own heads against the quarry walls. Others starved themselves, refusing the meager rations. Suicide was escape, but most died slowly. Dehydration kills in days in Mediterranean heat. Starvation takes weeks. Disease spread in the crowded, filthy conditions killed faster. The quarries were efficient multi-vector killing machines. And when Syracuse eventually sold the survivors, they were broken men. Traumatized, physically destroyed, psychologically shattered. Perfect slaves, no fight left in them. The buyers knew this. The entire system was optimized for profit. The civilization that invented democracy also invented the cost-effective death pit, Aegospotami, 405 BCE. The beach is crowded with captured Athenian sailors, 3,000 men, maybe 4,000. Sources disagree on the exact count. They're exhausted, defeated, confused. The Battle of Aegospotami was a complete Spartan victory. But it wasn't much of a battle, more like a surprise attack on beach ships. The Athenians expect ransom negotiations. They've been fighting Sparta for 27 years. They know how this works. Prisoners get exchanged or ransomed. It's civilized warfare between Greek city-states. Lysander, the Spartan admiral, has other plans. He orders all the prisoners executed. All of them. Every single man. Xenophon records it in his Hellenica. Lysander executed the Athenian prisoners, not less than 3,000 men. Plutarch gives a slightly different account. He killed all the Athenians he captured, about 4,000 men, and he threw their bodies into the sea. The numbers vary, but the act is consistent. Mass execution of prisoners after the battle ended. Why? Retaliation. Earlier in the Peloponnesian War, Athens had committed atrocities against captured enemies. After capturing 2 triremes at the Battle of Notion, the Athenians executed the entire crews, about 400 men. After victories at various points in the war, Athens had voted to execute prisoners rather than ransom them. Lysander was applying Athenian precedent. If Athens could execute prisoners, so could Sparta. But there's another layer. Political calculation. Athens was starving, besieged, desperate. The Athenian navy was its last hope. Aegospotami destroyed that hope. But Lysander wanted to ensure Athens couldn't rebuild. Every Athenian sailor executed was one less rower for future fleets. The executions were strategic population reduction, and Lysander had legal cover. Before the battle, representatives from Athens' subject cities Athens had brutalized during the war, came to Lysander and demanded justice. They asked Lysander to punish Athens the way Athens had punished others. Lysander consulted his allies. They voted, execute the Athenian prisoners. This wasn't Spartan brutality. This was collective Greek vengeance, democratically approved by Athens' former victims. The method of execution isn't specified in the sources. Mass beheadings, strangulation, pushing off cliffs. Ancient texts rarely describe execution mechanics unless they're particularly unusual. The prisoners were killed efficiently and their bodies disposed of. That's all that mattered. But imagine being one of those 3,000 men. You fought in a losing battle. You surrendered expecting ransom. You're standing on the beach with thousands of others, waiting for negotiations. Then the Spartans start organizing you into groups. Then they start killing. No trials, no charges, no speeches. Just systematic execution of prisoners who had surrendered. And you realize, this is what Athens did to others. This is Melos. This is Scione. This is Mytilene's original death sentence before it was narrowly reversed. All those assembly votes to execute prisoners. Now, Athens is on the receiving end. The pattern has come full circle. Lysander didn't invent this brutality. Athens modeled it. Sparta learned from Athens and applied the lesson with Spartan efficiency. The executions at Aegospotami weren't the war's final atrocity, but they symbolized its nature. The Peloponnesian War had started as a conventional conflict between Greek city-states. It ended with mass executions, starvation sieges, and total war. Thucydides had predicted this. His history documents the moral decay of the war, how it started with appeals to justice and honor, how it degenerated into naked power politics, how civilized rules broke down under pressure. The Melian dialogue marked the point of no return, when Athens explicitly said, "Might makes right," and abandoned moral justification. Athens removed any constraints on warfare. If justice doesn't matter, only power, then anything is permitted. Lysander understood this perfectly. Athens had established the rules, Sparta played by them, and those 3,000 men on the beach at Aegospotami paid the price for Athens' decades of imperial brutality. But here's the final twist. Lysander's executions weren't universally condemned in Greece. Some Greeks celebrated them as justice. Athens had terrorized the Aegean for decades. Lysander's mass execution was seen by many as Athens finally receiving what Athens had given others. Within months, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down. The fleet was reduced to 12 ships. The Athenian Empire ended. And it ended on a beach at Aegospotami with the execution of 3,000 men who died because Athens had taught Greece that prisoners were expendable. An Olympic boxing match, 492 BCE. Two men stand in the afternoon sun, their hands wrapped in leather thongs reinforced with metal plates, the hymantes oxeas, the sharp thongs. No rounds, no time limits, no referee interventions. They fight until one man can't continue. The fight begins. Jabs to the face, crosses to the temple. The goal isn't points, it's incapacitation. Breaking bones is encouraged, blinding is legal, killing is acceptable. 20 minutes in, one boxer's ear is torn half off. Blood streams down his face. He doesn't stop. 30 minutes in, the other boxer's orbital bone cracks. His eye swells shut. Neither man quits. 40 minutes in, one finally drops. Unconscious. Maybe dead, the sources don't specify. The victor is crowned. The loser is dragged from the stadium. This is glory. Here's what Olympic combat sports actually were. Legalized brutality designed to produce maximum injury while audiences cheered. Boxing had no weight classes, no protective equipment, no medical oversight. The hymantes, leather straps wrapped around the fists, were designed to protect the boxer's hands while maximizing damage to the opponent. Later versions incorporated metal plates, sharp edges, and spikes. The goal was simple: render your opponent unable to continue. How you accomplished that didn't matter. Broken noses, shattered jaws, crushed eye sockets, all acceptable. Expected even? Philostratus, writing in the 3rd century CE, describes typical injuries. Many boxers who led with their heads have had their temples crushed. Others have lost their eyes from blows to the brow bone. Still others have had their teeth knocked out at the root. These weren't freak accidents. These were standard outcomes. The pancration, all powers, was even more brutal. It combined boxing and wrestling with almost no restrictions. You could strike, kick, choke, break joints. The only prohibitions were biting and eye gouging, and even those rules were inconsistently enforced. Submission was signaled by raising one finger, but submission required consciousness. If you were choked unconscious, the fight continued until someone realized you were dead or dying. We mentioned Archeon of Phegalia earlier, the champion who died while winning, but he wasn't unique. Multiple pancratiasts died during Olympic competition. Their deaths were celebrated, not mourned. Dio Chrysostom, writing in the 1st century CE, describes a pancration match. They are permitted to kick, strike, and strangle. They can dislocate joints and break fingers if the opponent is foolish enough to offer them. Victory goes to the man who either makes his opponent submit or renders him unconscious. The key phrase, or renders him unconscious. Winning by knocking out your opponent was standard. Winning by killing him was rare, but celebrated when it happened. But the psychological dimension is darker than the physical brutality. Combat sports weren't just entertainment. They were civic virtue, made flesh. Young men trained in pancration and boxing because these sports prove masculine excellence, military readiness, and divine favor. Cities sponsored athletes, funding their training and travel. Winning Olympians received not just glory, but cash prizes, pensions, and tax exemptions. The city that produced a champion gained prestige throughout Greece. So cities had incentive to produce winners, and winning required brutality. Training methods reflected this. Philostratus describes the regimen. Boxers trained by punching bags weighted with sand and grain, building hand speed and power. They practiced on wooden posts, conditioning their knuckles. They sparred with minimal protection, learning to take hits. Pancratiasts trained by grappling with larger, stronger opponents. They practiced chokes until they could render a man unconscious in seconds. They drilled joint locks until they could snap an arm or dislocate a shoulder in one motion. The training was designed to produce fighters who could inflict maximum damage without hesitation. Mercy was weakness. Restraint was failure. Wrestling had fewer fatalities but was still brutal. The goal was forcing your opponent's back to touch the ground 3 times. Broken bones were common, permanent injuries were expected. Leontiscos of Sicily won 2 Olympic wrestling titles by specializing in breaking opponents' fingers. His technique, grab fingers, bend them backward until they broke, use the pain to force submission. It was legal, effective, and left opponents permanently disabled. He was celebrated for it. Pindar composed an ode to him. The ancient Olympic combat sports weren't metaphors for warfare. They were warfare, stripped of political context, refined into pure violent competition, and celebrated as the pinnacle of human achievement. Athens, 399 BCE, a prison cell. The philosopher Socrates sits calmly with his students. His trial is over. He's been convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth. The sentence, death by drinking hemlock. An executioner enters carrying a cup. The hemlock has been prepared. Water hemlock, cicuta virosa, ground and mixed with wine to mask the taste. Socrates takes the cup without hesitation. He drinks it down. Then he walks around the cell, as instructed, waiting for his legs to get heavy. Plato records what happens next in the Phaedo. The man who had given him the poison kept feeling his feet and legs. After a while, he pressed hard on his foot and asked if he felt it. Socrates said no. Then he pressed his legs and so gradually upward, showing us that he was growing cold and stiff. Paralysis spreads from the legs upward. Socrates continues talking with his students about the immortality of the soul even as his body shuts down. When the paralysis reaches his abdomen, his breathing becomes labored. His heart struggles. Finally, his diaphragm stops working. Asphyxiation. Socrates suffocates to death while fully conscious. This was Athens' preferred method of executing citizens. Not quick decapitation, not strangling. Slow death by poison that preserved the body while shutting down the nervous system from the extremities inward. And they forced the condemned to drink it themselves. Here's what makes hemlock execution particularly dark. It's prolonged, it's conscious, and it's designed to appear dignified while being horrific. Hemlock contains conion, a neurotoxin that blocks nerve signals to muscles. The paralysis spreads gradually over 30 minutes to 3 hours, depending on dosage. The condemned person remains fully alert, fully aware, experiencing respiratory distress as their diaphragm fails, but unable to move or cry out. It's death by internal suffocation while conscious. Athens used hemlock because it was considered civilized. No blood, no visible violence, no messy executions. The condemned drank willingly, under coercion, but technically willingly, then died in their cell surrounded by friends if they had any, but read the medical descriptions of hemlock poisoning. It's not peaceful. The paralysis creates a sensation of suffocating, of drowning, of desperate need to breathe while the muscles refuse to function. Panic is common. Terror is universal. Plato's description of Socrates' calm is either heroic philosophy or propaganda. Most hemlock executions probably looked less like serene philosophical discussions and more like men dying in terror. And Athens used this method frequently. During the Peloponnesian War, when Athens lost at Syracuse, the assembly voted to execute 8 generals for failing to recover the bodies of dead sailors after the Battle of Arginusae. 6 were present. All 6 were executed by hemlock. During the 30 tyrants' reign, hemlock executions accelerated. Anyone accused of disloyalty was given the poison. After democracy was restored, Athens executed supporters of the 30. More hemlock. The poison became Athenian democracy's execution method of choice. Clean, legal, bureaucratic. You could vote in the assembly in the morning to execute someone, and by evening, they'd be dead in their cell. And the process was systematic. The 11, magistrates responsible for executions, maintained a supply of hemlock. They had designated executioners who prepared the poison, supervised the drinking, monitored the death. It was professionalized killing, but hemlock wasn't the only method. Athens also used apotympanismos, death by beating with clubs while bound to a board. This was reserved for specific crimes: piracy, temple robbery, treason. The condemned was bound to a wooden plank, beaten with clubs until bones broke and internal organs ruptured, then left in public to die slowly. The message was clear. Athens could kill you cleanly with hemlock if you were a citizen. Athens could torture you to death publicly if you weren't, or if your crime demanded spectacle. The execution of Socrates gets romanticized, the philosopher calmly accepting death, delivering profound last words. Credo, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Dying surrounded by devoted students. But strip away the philosophy. An elderly man was forced by his own city to drink poison and die by slow asphyxiation because he asked inconvenient questions and embarrassed powerful people. Democracy didn't prevent this. Democracy enabled it. The assembly voted on executions. The courts convicted the condemned. The 11 carried out the sentences. It was legal, transparent, and thoroughly democratic. Athens perfected it. Democracy perfected it and called it justice. Sparta wasn't just brutal to helots and enemies. Sparta was brutal to Spartans. The agoge, Sparta's education system, started at age 7. Boys were removed from their families and placed in communal barracks. For the next 13 years, they would be systematically brutalized, starved, and traumatized into becoming perfect warriors. Here's what the agoge actually involved. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Lycurgus. The boys were given minimal clothing, 1 cloak per year, regardless of weather. They slept on reed mats without blankets. They were deliberately underfed to teach them to steal food, but if caught stealing, they were severely beaten. Let's pause on that. Spartan boys were starved, then punished for the predictable result of starvation, stealing food. The system wasn't about teaching self-sufficiency. It was about creating constant fear and arbitrary punishment. The boys were beaten regularly, not just as punishment, but as conditioning. Plutarch mentions a ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were whipped until they bled, sometimes until they died, as a test of endurance. Spectators would watch. Families would attend. Boys who cried out or showed pain brought shame to their families. Some boys died from the beatings. This was considered acceptable. Those who survived proved their worth, but the psychological brutality exceeded the physical. Boys were organized into herds, agili, and packs, eli, each supervised by an older youth who had authority to beat them. They were pitted against each other in contests, fights, endurance tests, competitions, where the losers faced punishment. The system was designed to eliminate empathy, crush individuality, and produce obedient soldiers. At age 12, boys were assigned older male mentors. The institutionalized pederasty we mentioned earlier, these weren't loving relationships. They were power dynamics where older warriors claimed younger boys for sexual and social purposes, euphemized as mentorship. The boys couldn't refuse. Refusal meant being labeled weak or effeminate, social death in Sparta. At age 20, if a Spartan youth passed his trials, he became a full citizen with military obligations. If he failed, he became a hypomeon, an inferior, stripped of citizenship rights, socially ostracized, often impoverished. But even full Spartan citizens lived under constant surveillance. They ate communal meals in Syssitia, messes where they were watched for signs of weakness or disloyalty. They couldn't travel without permission. They couldn't engage in trade or commerce. That was forbidden as corrupting. They existed solely to serve the state militarily. And Sparta practiced eugenics. Newborns were examined by elders. Those deemed weak or deformed were exposed on Mount Taygetus. Even among a society that practiced exposure, Sparta's version was systematized and state-mandated. But the darkest aspect was what happened to Spartans who showed weakness in battle. Survivors of military defeats, men who fled rather than died, were marked as tresants, tremblers. They were required to wear distinctive clothing, couldn't hold office, couldn't marry, and were subjected to random beatings by any citizen. After the Battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE, where Sparta suffered a catastrophic defeat. So many Spartans had fled that the city faced a crisis, too many tremblers to maintain social order. The ephors declared a temporary amnesty, but the stigma remained. Spartan citizens who showed cowardice were better off dead. Survival with dishonor was worse than death. And the equality Sparta was famous for? Propaganda. Sparta had massive inequality. Full citizens, Spartiates, comprised maybe 10% of Sparta's population. Below them were the perioikoi, free non-citizens, and below them the helots, enslaved Greeks. Even among Spartiates, wealth disparities created social hierarchy. The myth of Spartan equality was manufactured to hide a brutally hierarchical society where a tiny warrior class terrorized everyone else, including their own children. Sparta didn't produce heroes. Sparta produced traumatized, obedient soldiers who knew nothing but violence and fear. The society celebrated for its warriors was actually a machine for systematically breaking children and remaking them into instruments of state violence. And it worked. Spartan soldiers were feared throughout Greece. But the cost was a society where children were beaten publicly, where weakness was punishable by death or worse, where citizens lived in constant fear of exposure, and where the state claimed total control over every aspect of life. The ruins of ancient Sparta are unimpressive. The city built nothing permanent because it focused entirely on military power. That tells you everything about Sparta's values. Sparta fell because its system was unsustainable, but the mythology survived, the myth of Spartan virtue, equality, and heroism. The reality was systematic child abuse in a society built entirely on violence. Athens, 594 BCE. A farmer stands in the agora, his head bowed. He owes money, not much, just enough to feed his family through a bad harvest. But he can't pay. The creditor stands before him, flanked by witnesses. Under Athenian law, the farmer has three options: pay the debt, flee Athens and abandon his land, or become a slave. He has no money, he has nowhere to go. The creditor takes possession, not just of the farmer's land, but of the farmer himself. The farmer is now property. This is debt slavery. And before Solon's reforms in 594 BCE, approximately 1/6 of Athenian citizens were enslaved for debt. Let that sink in. 1 in 6 Athenian citizens, freeborn Greeks, members of the community, had been enslaved by other Athenians for unpaid debts. Not war captives, not foreigners, their own people. Here's how it worked. Ancient Greece didn't have bankruptcy protection. If you borrowed money and couldn't repay it, your person became collateral. The creditor could enslave you until the debt was worked off. In theory, debt slavery was temporary. Once the debt was satisfied, you'd be freed. In practice, the terms were set by creditors, and most debt slaves never earned enough to buy their freedom. The system was called hektemeroi in Athens, sixth parters, because many peasants worked land where they owed 1/6 of their produce to creditors. If they fell behind, they became debt slaves. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Solon. The poor were enslaved to the rich. They worked the lands of the wealthy and paid them 1/6 of the produce. If they failed to pay, they and their children could be seized and enslaved. And it wasn't just the debtor. The entire family could be enslaved. Your children, your wife, all became property of the creditor if you defaulted. Families were broken apart, sold to different owners, scattered across Greece and beyond. Debt slavery didn't just destroy the debtor. It destroyed entire households. The scale was staggering. Aristotle, in his Athenian Constitution, describes pre-Solonian Athens. The many were enslaved to the few. Not only were they themselves enslaved, but so were their children and wives. They were called hektimeroi, and also peletai, because they worked the lands of the rich for this rent. Solon's reforms in 594 BCE were revolutionary. He canceled existing debts, the seisachtheia, shaking off of burdens, freed Athenian citizens who had been enslaved for debt, and banned future debt slavery of Athenian citizens. It was one of the foundational reforms that made Athenian democracy possible. You can't have democratic citizens if 1/6 of them are enslaved to the other 5/6. But Solon's reforms only applied to Athenian citizens in Athens. Debt slavery continued in other Greek city-states. Sparta didn't have debt slavery because Spartans couldn't engage in commerce, but most other cities did. And even after Solon, Athens still enslaved foreign residents and non-citizens for debt. The practice reveals something dark about Greek economics. Credit was available, but it was predatory. Interest rates were high. 12–18% annually was common, sometimes much higher. Loans were secured not just against property, but against persons. And the legal system favored creditors overwhelmingly. Courts would enforce debt claims ruthlessly. And here's what makes it darker. The system created a permanent underclass. Former debt slaves, even after being freed by Solon's reforms, were marked. They'd lost their land, their status, their place in society. Many became wage laborers, technically free, but economically desperate. The cycle continued. Desperate men borrowed money, couldn't repay, lost everything. Their children grew up poor, borrowed money, couldn't repay, lost everything. Debt slavery might have been abolished for citizens, but debt servitude, economic bondage that kept families trapped in poverty, continued. And for non-citizens, debt slavery remained legal. Foreign merchants, medics, freed slaves, all could be enslaved for debt. The protections Solon created applied only to a privileged minority. Everyone else remained vulnerable. The system lasted for centuries. Even after Greek cities began limiting or abolishing debt slavery, the underlying economic dynamics remained. Credit was predatory, defaults were common, and the poor were vulnerable to exploitation by the wealthy. Greek city-states pioneered democracy, philosophy, and art. They also pioneered a credit system that systematically enslaved the poor to the rich. Debt slavery was the economic foundation that made leisure, and thus philosophy, art, and politics, possible for the wealthy. The marble and the philosophy were built on the backs of debt slaves. Athens, or 15 BCE. Dawn breaks over the city. Citizens emerge from their homes to find a scene of systematic vandalism. Throughout Athens, the Hermae, sacred stone pillars with the head of Hermes carved at the top and an erect phallus carved below, have been mutilated. Faces smashed, phalluses broken off. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of sacred markers defaced in a single night. The city erupts in panic. This isn't random vandalism. The Hermae marked boundaries, protected travelers, stood at doorways and intersections throughout Athens. They were sacred to Hermes, god of travelers and thieves, protector of the city. Defacing them was an act of massive religious impiety, and Athens was about to launch the Sicilian expedition, the largest military campaign in its history. Was this sabotage, a curse, a conspiracy? The assembly convened immediately. Rewards were offered for information. Accusations flew, and Athens did what Athens always did when panicked. It turned to torture and execution. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Thucydides describes it in his history. The Athenians took the matter very seriously, regarding it as ominous for the expedition and as evidence of a conspiracy to overthrow the democracy. Informants came forward. Under torture and promise of immunity, slaves and medics began naming names. Here's what happened. Athens instituted a reign of terror based on forced confessions and paranoid accusations. Slaves were tortured to extract testimony. Remember, under Greek law, slave testimony was only admissible if obtained through torture. The logic was that slaves would lie to protect themselves unless pain forced truth from them. Except, torture doesn't produce truth. It produces whatever the torturer wants to hear. Desperate slaves, under extreme pain, named anyone they thought might satisfy their torturers. The accusations spread like wildfire. Citizens were arrested on flimsy evidence. Some fled Athens before they could be arrested. Their flight was taken as proof of guilt. Property was confiscated. Families were destroyed. And at the center of it all was Alcibiades, the charismatic general who had championed the Sicilian expedition. Alcibiades was accused, probably falsely, of participating in the mutilation and also of profaning the Eleusinian mysteries by performing mock versions in private homes. The evidence was shaky, based largely on testimony extracted under torture and accusations from political enemies. But in the climate of panic, evidence didn't matter. Alcibiades demanded to stand trial immediately before the fleet departed. His enemies wanted him to sail first, then be recalled for trial, ensuring he couldn't defend himself effectively. The assembly voted to let him sail. Then, after the fleet left, they recalled him for trial. Alcibiades, knowing he'd be convicted in the paranoid atmosphere, fled to Sparta and defected. But the persecution continued in Athens. More arrests, more torture, more confessions, implicating others. The cycle fed itself. Plutarch records that dozens were executed. Dozens more fled into exile. Families were destroyed, fortunes confiscated. And the actual perpetrators? Never definitively identified. Some historians suggest it was a drunken prank by aristocratic youths. Others suggest political sabotage by opponents of the Sicilian expedition. Still others think it was deliberate provocation by Alcibiades' enemies to discredit him. We'll never know. But what we do know is that Athens' response to religious vandalism was systematic terror. Torture of slaves, execution of citizens, exile of dozens, confiscation of property, destruction of families, all based on confessions extracted under torture and accusations made in an atmosphere of hysteria. The Hermes scandal reveals how quickly democratic societies can turn to terror when fear overrides reason. Athens, the birthplace of rational philosophy, abandoned rationality entirely when faced with religious panic. The assembly, which debated policy carefully in normal times, voted for emergency measures that bypassed legal protections. And the method was instructive. Use torture to generate confessions. Use confessions to justify more arrests. Use arrests to confiscate property. Use property to fund more investigations. It was self-perpetuating terror with the veneer of legal process. The Sicilian expedition, the campaign the Hermes scandal supposedly threatened, ended in catastrophic defeat. Whether the vandalism was actually an omen or just Athens destroying itself through paranoia is impossible to say. But the scandal accelerated Athens' decline by driving Alcibiades into Sparta's arms, where he advised Athens' enemies on how to defeat Athens. The Hermae were eventually replaced. The scars from the terror lasted much longer. Athens had shown that democratic process and legal protections were fragile, easily suspended when citizens were frightened. The pattern would repeat throughout history. Fear plus power equals terror, regardless of political system. The mutilated Hermae were religious vandalism. Athens' response was state terror, and democracy approved it all. A courtroom in Athens, 350 BCE. A slave stands in the corner, terrified. His master is being sued by a neighbor in a property dispute. Both sides are presenting evidence, documents, witness testimony, appeals to law. Then the plaintiff makes a proposal. Let us put this slave to the question. Under torture, he will tell us the truth about who owns the disputed land. This is the basanos, judicial torture, and it was standard legal procedure throughout the Greek world. Here's what textbooks rarely emphasize. Greek courts routinely tortured slaves to obtain testimony, believing that pain produced truth. The basanos wasn't occasional or exceptional. It was assumed that slave testimony was only reliable if extracted under torture. Free persons couldn't be tortured, usually, but slaves could be, and regularly were. The logic was perverse. Greeks believed that slaves had natural incentive to lie. They'd protect their masters or lie to avoid punishment. Therefore, only through torture could you overcome their natural dishonesty and extract truth. Pain made testimony reliable. Demosthenes, the famous orator, discusses basanos casually in multiple speeches. In the matter of slaves, torture is the most certain method of obtaining the truth. The law itself acknowledges this, and we all agree that testimony given under torture is more trustworthy than that given freely. The methods were brutal. The strappado, suspending the victim by their wrists tied behind their back, dislocating shoulders. The wheel, stretching the body on a rotating device, tearing muscles and joints. Beating with clubs or whips until flesh split. Burning with hot irons. The goal was sufficient pain to overcome any incentive to lie, without killing the slave, who was, after all, valuable property. But here's the dark irony. Torture doesn't produce truth. It produces whatever ends the pain. Modern studies and common sense show that people under torture will say anything their torturers want to hear. They'll confess to crimes they didn't commit, implicate innocent people, fabricate entire narratives. The Greeks knew this. Aristotle discusses it in his Rhetoric. As for evidence from torture, it is a kind of evidence, and it appears trustworthy because necessity is added to it. But it is not difficult to deal with such evidence in argument. People under torture tell lies just as often as they tell truth, some being ready to endure everything rather than tell the truth, while others are ready to make false charges. Aristotle understood that torture was unreliable, yet the practice continued for centuries because it served other purposes: intimidation, punishment, the appearance of thorough investigation, and giving judges something definitive to base decisions on, even if that something was fabricated. The legal framework was precise. Masters couldn't torture their own slaves in their own cases. That would be too easily manipulated. But they could offer their slaves for torture by the opposing party. This created a perverse game. Offering your slave for torture signaled confidence in your case if you were certain the slave would confirm your story under torture, or was a bluff, hoping the opposing party wouldn't actually torture someone, since they'd be liable for any permanent damage to valuable property. Refusing an offer of torture could be used against you in court. If your case was strong, why wouldn't you accept the offer to torture this slave who would confirm your story? Prosecutors and defendants were trapped by the logic of the system, and the torture was public. Cases were tried before large citizen juries, sometimes 201 or 501 jurors. When slaves were tortured for testimony, it happened in public view, or with detailed reports given to the jury. The spectacle was part of the evidence. The screams, the visible suffering, the broken body, all served to convince jurors that truth had been extracted. Slaves who survived torture were often permanently damaged. Dislocated shoulders that never healed properly, scars from burns and beatings, is psychological trauma. But they were property, and property could be damaged in service of legal proceedings. Masters could theoretically sue for compensation if torture permanently damaged their slave, but the compensation rarely matched the actual value lost. And here's what makes it darkest. The practice was so normalized that litigants would complain if their opponents refused to provide slaves for torture. In Against Pananidas, Demosthenes argues that his opponent's refusal to hand over slaves for torture proves the opponent has something to hide. He says his slaves know nothing, then let him hand them over for torture. If they truly know nothing, the torture will reveal it. The circular logic is maddening. If you refuse torture, you must be lying. If you accept torture, the tortured testimony is treated as definitive truth. There's no escape from the system. But torture wasn't limited to civil cases. Criminal prosecutions used it extensively. Slaves were tortured to implicate their masters in crimes. During political trials, like those following the Herms mutilation, slaves were tortured en masse to generate accusations. The system became a machine for producing confessions and implicating others, regardless of actual guilt. The practice spread throughout the Mediterranean. Rome adopted it from the Greeks, initially limiting torture to slaves, then expanding it to lower-class citizens, then eventually to anyone accused of certain crimes. By the late Roman Empire, torture was routine in criminal investigations, but the Greeks pioneered it as legal procedure, as evidence production, as truth-seeking methodology. They built it into their legal system, created protocols and procedures, wrote laws regulating who could be tortured and when, and philosophers like Demosthenes and Aristotle discussed it as casually as we discuss DNA evidence. Greek courts, celebrated for introducing jury trials and adversarial legal proceedings, also introduced systematic judicial torture as standard practice. The civilization that invented legal theory also invented truth through pain as a judicial principle. And it worked, not at finding truth, but at maintaining social hierarchy. Free citizens couldn't be tortured, slaves could be. The torture system was one more way of marking slaves as fundamentally different, as bodies that could be violated for the convenience of their social superiors. The Basanos wasn't aberrational. It was fundamental to how Greek justice functioned: democracy and torture, philosophy and pain, legal procedure and systematic violation, all coexisting, all considered normal, all operating for centuries. Plataea, 427 BCE. The city has finally fallen after a 2-year siege. The Plataeans, starving, exhausted, hopeless, surrendered to the besieging Spartan and Theban forces. They expect terms. They expect negotiations. Plataea has been Sparta's ally for generations, fought alongside Sparta at Marathon, hosted Spartan forces during the Persian Wars. Surely that loyalty counts for something. The Spartan commander, Artemis, asks each Plataean prisoner a single question. Have you done anything to benefit Sparta and her allies in this war? It's a trap. Any answer that acknowledges helping Athens, and Plataea was formerly allied with Athens in the Peloponnesian War, is a confession of hostility to Sparta. Any claim of helping Sparta is easily disproven. Plataea was besieged precisely because it sided with Athens. The Plataeans try appealing to their long history with Sparta, to the alliance forged during the Persian Wars, to basic mercy. The Spartan judges are unmoved. Thucydides records the proceeding. The Spartans asked each man individually whether he had done anything to benefit Sparta and her allies in the present war. When each man said he had not, they took him away and killed him, making no exception for anyone. 200 Plataean prisoners, 25 Athenian soldiers who had been in the city, all executed. Then the Spartans enslaved the Plataean women and razed the city to the ground. Plataea, one of Greece's oldest cities, Sparta's longtime ally, a name synonymous with Greek resistance to Persia, was erased. Here's what makes it worse. Plataea had fought for Greek independence at Marathon. When Athens called for help against the Persian invasion in 490 BCE, Plataea sent 1,000 hoplites, a huge proportion of their small city's military strength. When most Greek cities stayed neutral or collaborated with Persia, Plataea fought. When the Persians returned in 479 BCE, the final decisive battle was fought at Plataea. The city gave its name to the battle that secured Greek freedom. 48 years later, Sparta destroyed it. Not for treachery, not for betrayal, for being caught between two larger powers and choosing the wrong side in their war. The massacre reveals the hollowness of Greek interstate relations. Alliances meant nothing. Historical loyalty counted for nothing. When strategic interests changed, cities would destroy former allies without hesitation. And the execution method was coldly bureaucratic. Each prisoner was asked the same question. Each gave similar answers, appeals to old alliances, explanations of their impossible position, pleas for mercy. Each was led away and killed. 225 men, executed individually, systematically, after they'd surrendered. This wasn't battlefield frenzy. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment violence. This was calculated, cold, legal murder of prisoners who had surrendered expecting terms. But here's the pattern. Sparta wasn't alone in this. Athens had done the same to others, Melos, Scione, Mytilene. Thebes would do it to others. Every major Greek power engaged in this practice. Besiege a city, accept surrender, execute or enslave the population, raise the structures. The destruction of Plataea showed that in Greek interstate politics, nothing was sacred. Not historical alliance, not shared culture, not common ethnicity, not the bonds forged in resistance to foreign invasion. When convenient, all of it could be discarded, and the reasoning was explicitly stated in Thucydides' account. The Thebans argued to the Spartans, Plataea sided with Athens. They are therefore our enemies. What we do to our enemies is our own business. We owe them nothing. The Spartans agreed. Loyalty was conditional, and the conditions changed whenever expedient. The lesson was clear. No alliance protected you if you became inconvenient. No history mattered if you chose wrong in current conflicts. After the execution, the city was demolished. The buildings were torn down stone by stone. The walls were razed. The land was given to private Theban citizens to farm. Plataea ceased to exist as an independent entity. Years later, after Sparta eventually lost the Theban War, Plataea was refounded. But the refounded city was a shadow of the original. The population was mostly new settlers. The continuity was broken. The massacre of Plataea wasn't the largest atrocity of the Peloponnesian War, but it was perhaps the most symbolic. It showed that Greek civilization, which prided itself on shared culture and common Hellenism, would destroy its own heritage when politically convenient. Plataea saved Greece in 479 BCE. Greece destroyed Plataea in 427 BCE. That's the pattern. No loyalty transcends immediate political interest. No alliance survives strategic realignment. No city is safe, regardless of its history. The ruins of ancient Plataea are still visible in Boeotia. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of the siege, the destruction, the refounding. But you won't find memorials to the 225 men executed after surrendering. The The bones are gone. The names are lost. The gratitude Greece owed Plataea died with them. The Aegean Sea, 3rd century BCE. A merchant vessel rounds a promontory near Crete. Suddenly, a sleek warship emerges from a hidden cove. Pirates. The merchant vessel tries to run. It's too late. The pirate ship, built for speed, intercepts easily. The pirates board, subdue the crew, secure the cargo. Then they do something that reveals the systematic nature of Greek piracy. They separate the captives by apparent wealth, interrogate them about ransom potential, and make immediate calculations about whether to ransom them or sell them at the next slave market. This isn't chaotic banditry. This is professional kidnapping and human trafficking, and it was a major industry throughout the Greek world for centuries. Here's what gets sanitized in histories. Piracy wasn't aberrational in ancient Greece. It was endemic, semi-legitimate, and often operated with tacit or explicit support from Greek cities. Certain locations, particularly Crete and the Cilician coast, were notorious pirate havens where entire communities lived off raiding, kidnapping, and slave trading. Strabo, the geographer, describes the Cilician pirates in detail. The Cilicians began with raiding on a small scale, then grew bolder. Finally, they began operating in large squadrons under organized commanders, raiding coastal cities, besieging fortifications, and capturing merchant fleets entire. These weren't isolated criminals. They were organized fleets operating from secure bases, with sophisticated business models, capture ships and cargo, kidnap passengers and crew, assess ransom potential, sell non-profitable captives as slaves, maintain relationships with slave markets like Delos to ensure quick sales. The scale was staggering. Appian records that, at their height, the Cilician pirates operated 1,000 ships and controlled 400 coastal cities and fortifications. Plutarch mentions they captured more than 400 cities. These numbers might be exaggerated, but even if cut in half, they indicate massive operations. And Greek cities often tolerated or supported pirates. Why? Because pirates preyed on other people's merchants while selling goods cheaply in the pirates' home ports. A city like Crete could benefit economically from piracy without directly engaging in it. Pirates would sell captured cargo and slaves at Cretan ports, generating tax revenue and cheap goods. The relationship between piracy and slavery was symbiotic. Pirates supplied the slave markets. The markets gave pirates reliable places to convert captives into cash quickly. Strabo explicitly connects Cilician piracy to the Delos slave market. The Cilicians found the business profitable because the markets, especially the one at Delos, could receive many thousands of slaves in a single day. Think about what that means. A supply chain existed where pirates could kidnap people, Greek and non-Greek alike, and sell them same day at established markets. The infrastructure supported industrial-scale human trafficking. But here's what makes it darker. Captured Greeks could be ransomed if they had wealthy families. If not, they were enslaved, Greeks enslaving Greeks through piracy. The ethnic solidarity Greeks claimed when facing Persians or other foreigners evaporated when profit was involved, and some pirates were celebrated. Certain pirate leaders became wealthy and powerful enough to negotiate with major powers. They'd retire from piracy by accepting bribes from cities to leave their shipping alone, essentially running protection rackets on a regional scale. The Romans eventually crushed the Cilician pirates in 67 BCE under Pompey, who conducted a massive 3-month campaign that destroyed pirate bases throughout the Mediterranean. But for centuries before that, Greek piracy operated openly, fed the slave markets, kidnapped thousands, and was tacitly accepted as part of Mediterranean commerce. Greek historians occasionally condemned piracy morally, but described it as inevitable, even natural. Thucydides, in the opening of his History, discusses piracy as a traditional Greek occupation. In ancient times, Hellenic and barbarian populations living on the coast and islands took to piracy. This was not yet considered disgraceful, but rather brought a certain glory. That's the attitude? Piracy was a profession, not a crime, risky but legitimate. Like privateering in later centuries, piracy occupied a gray area between crime and warfare, between illegality and sanctioned violence. And the victims? Merchants who lost cargo, travelers who were kidnapped, coastal villagers raided by pirates. Their suffering was the cost of doing business in the Mediterranean. No organized effort to suppress piracy existed until Rome decided it threatened their interests. The Greek world tolerated industrial-scale piracy for centuries because the benefits, cheap slaves, cheap goods, weakening rival cities' trade, outweighed the costs. The civilization that invented philosophy and democracy also invented human trafficking as a systematic business model. Delos, the slave market island, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. Tourists visit the ruins. Tour guides mention it was a major trading center. They rarely mention that trade meant tens of thousands of kidnapped people sold daily. The pirate bases in Crete and Cilicia are picturesque ruins now. The kidnapping business is forgotten. A theatrical troupe arrives in Corinth, 380 BCE. They're traveling performers, actors, musicians, stage technicians. They've been hired to perform at a local festival. The performances go well. The audience is pleased. Then comes time to collect payment. The sponsor, a wealthy Corinthian, decides the performance wasn't worth the agreed price. He pays half. The troupe protests. The sponsor has them beaten and driven from the city. There's no legal recourse. Traveling performers had almost no legal protections in ancient Greece. They were artistic vagrants, moving from city to city, vulnerable to exploitation, abuse, and theft. Here's what gets romanticized about Greek theater. We remember the plays, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. We remember the magnificent theaters, the festivals, the cultural importance. What we forget are the performers themselves, whose lives were precarious and often brutal. Actors in major festivals, like the Dionysia in Athens, could achieve fame and wealth. These were prestigious positions, often held by Athenian citizens. But most performers weren't competing at major festivals. They were traveling troupes, performing at local celebrations, weddings, small-town festivals. And they were vulnerable. First, legal status. Many traveling performers were medics, foreign residents, or had no citizenship anywhere, moving constantly. Without citizenship in a Greek city, you had minimal legal rights. You couldn't own property, couldn't access courts on equal terms with citizens, couldn't appeal to civic authorities for protection. Second, payment. Contracts with traveling performers were difficult to enforce. If a sponsor refused to pay, or paid less than agreed, the performer had limited recourse. Taking the sponsor to court required legal standing, which non-citizens often lacked, money for legal fees, which traveling performers rarely had, and time, which delayed getting to the next performance in another city. So, sponsors could exploit performers with impunity, pay them late, pay them less, pay them nothing. The performers' options were accept the situation or leave, and leaving meant losing whatever payment they might eventually receive. Third, physical safety. Traveling performers were physically vulnerable, moving between cities with valuable equipment, costumes, musical instruments, stage props. They were targets for robbery. They couldn't travel with armed guards, too expensive. They relied on luck and the questionable protection of Greek hospitality customs. But hospitality protected guests, not performers. The distinction mattered. Performers weren't hosted by citizens. They camped outside cities or stayed in cheap lodgings. They weren't protected by guest friendship bonds. They were transient workers, expendable and vulnerable. Fourth, social status. Despite theater's cultural importance, many Greeks viewed actors with suspicion or contempt. Acting required embodying different characters, which some philosophers, including Plato, considered dishonest or corrupting. Performers were seen as morally suspect, too comfortable with deception, too willing to display emotion publicly, too theatrical. This prejudice had practical consequences. In disputes between citizens and performers, magistrates sided with citizens. When performers were victimized, investigations were perfunctory. Their low social status meant their testimony carried less weight. The playwright Demosthenes, in a legal speech, casually insults his opponent by comparing him to actors. He worked as a performer in traveling troupes, a man without citizen rights, a vagrant. The insult works because audiences understood that performers occupied a degraded social position. And here's a dark detail. Female performers were often assumed to be available for sexual exploitation. Women in theater were rare. Most female roles were played by male actors. But women who did perform were frequently treated as prostitutes or courtesans, regardless of their actual circumstances. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Athenaeus, in his De Hypnosophistae, discusses how wealthy men would proposition female musicians and performers at symposia. Refusal could mean lost work opportunities. Acceptance meant being labeled a hetaira, courtesan, which destroyed any pretense of respectability. Male performers faced different but equally degrading assumptions. The association between actors and effeminacy, between theatrical performance and unmanliness, created a stigma. Successful actors at major festivals could overcome this. Wealth and fame bought respect. But traveling performers, struggling to survive, carried the stigma without the compensating prestige, and physical danger was constant. Traveling performers were robbed, beaten, killed. If they were murdered on the road between cities, who investigated? Who prosecuted? They often had no family present to demand justice, no citizen status to make authorities care, no wealth to motivate investigation. The pattern shows up in sources occasionally, mentioned casually. Demosthenes references performers being beaten by drunken citizens. Plutarch mentions a case where a musician was robbed and no one prosecuted the thieves because the victim was just a traveling performer. Greek civilization created magnificent theater, profound tragedies, brilliant comedies. The plays are studied worldwide, performed constantly, considered foundations of Western drama. But the people who performed those plays, outside the elite actors and major festivals, lived precarious, vulnerable, exploited lives. The theater of Dionysus in Athens still stands. Tourists sit on ancient stone seats, imagining the performances. They don't think about the traveling troops beaten for demanding payment. The precarity has been forgotten. Athens, 432 BCUY, a herald walks through the agora reading from a notice board. The assembly has voted for war against Sparta. All Athenian citizens between ages 18 and 59 are required to report for military service. Failure to report means loss of citizenship, confiscation of property, exile, or execution as a traitor. There are no conscientious objectors in ancient Greece. There is no opting out. You serve or you're destroyed. This is how Greek military service actually worked: mandatory, enforced by severe penalties, and inescapable for citizens. The romantic notion of citizen soldiers volunteering to defend their cities is propaganda. Greek warfare was powered by compulsory service under threat of complete social annihilation. In Athens, military obligations were stratified by wealth. The wealthiest served as cavalry or trierarchs, commanders of warships who had to pay for maintenance themselves, a crushing financial burden. The middle classes served as hoplites, purchasing their own armor and weapons. The poorest served as rowers in the navy or as light infantry, but all served. Refusal wasn't an option. The legal framework was explicit. Athenian law defined several military offenses: lipotaxion, desertion from rank; astrateia, failure to report for military service; ripsaspia, throwing away one's shield in flight; and deilia, cowardice. Penalties range from loss of citizenship rights to death, depending on the offense and circumstances. Desertion in battle, leaving your position in the phalanx, could result in execution. But more commonly, it resulted in atimia, loss of civic rights. You couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't participate in religious festivals, couldn't access courts for legal protection. You remained in Athens but became a non-person, excluded from all civic life, and the stigma was permanent. Aristophanes' comedies mock cowards and deserters. One play features a character who threw away his shield in battle, a stock character for mockery. The audience laughed at men whose lives had been destroyed by showing fear in combat. Sparta was worse. Spartans who survived battles by fleeing, the tresants we discussed earlier, were subjected to ritual humiliation and random beatings. They were required to wear distinctive clothing, shave half their beards, and endure constant public degradation. Many committed suicide rather than live as tresants. But conscription wasn't just enforced by punishment, it was enforced by social pressure. Your father, brothers, and sons were fighting. Your neighbors and fellow citizens were fighting. Refusing meant betraying them, not just the state. Family honor demanded service. Community bonds required it. And there was nowhere to hide. Greek cities were small communities where everyone knew everyone. A man who failed to report for military service would be immediately noticed, publicly shamed, and prosecuted. Fleeing meant exile, losing family, property, and identity. The economic dimension made it worse. Wars disrupted farming and trade. Men called to military service couldn't tend their fields or operate their businesses. Families suffered economically while men were away campaigning. And if you died in war, your family lost its primary income source with minimal state support. Athens did provide some compensation, small pensions for disabled veterans, subsidies for war orphans. But these were inadequate. Most families of soldiers killed in war faced economic catastrophe. Yet refusing to serve meant guaranteed destruction, loss of citizenship, property confiscation, exile. The choice wasn't serve or don't serve. It was serve and possibly die, or refuse and definitely be destroyed socially and economically. And campaigns could last years. The Sicilian expedition kept Athenian forces away for 2 years before the catastrophic defeat. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years, with near-constant military obligations for all adult male citizens. Men spent years away from families, farms, and businesses, serving because refusal meant annihilation. The wealthy could sometimes avoid direct combat by serving as triarchs or cavalry, still dangerous, but less likely to die in a phalanx. But the middle and lower classes fought as hoplites or rowers with no escape. And even the wealthy couldn't escape military obligations entirely without social destruction. Desertion was common enough that laws explicitly addressed it, but deserters who were caught faced severe punishment as examples. After the Battle of Arginusi, Athens executed its own generals for failing to recover bodies of dead sailors. The message was clear: military obligations were absolute, even for commanders, and failures would be punished drastically. The pattern continued throughout Greek history. City-states needed militaries to survive. They staffed those militaries through mandatory service enforced by legal penalties and social pressure that made refusal unthinkable. Greek warfare wasn't powered by volunteers defending their homes. It was powered by compulsory service enforced by the threat of complete personal destruction. The citizen-soldier model that modern democracies celebrate as Greek legacy was actually a conscription system where citizens had no choice but to fight or face civic death. The freedom Greek warfare supposedly defended didn't include freedom to refuse military service. Thebes, September 335. BCE, the city has rebelled against Macedonian hegemony. Alexander the Great, only 22 years old and recently crowned, marches on the city with overwhelming force. The Thebans fight desperately, but they're outnumbered and outmatched. After a brief siege, Macedonian forces break through the walls. What happens next shocks even ancient observers. Alexander's forces slaughter approximately 6,000 Thebans in the streets. Not soldiers, civilians, men, women, elderly, young. The killing is systematic, brutal, and aimed at total destruction. Then Alexander sells the surviving population, approximately 30,000 people, into slavery. Every single Theban, enslaved. Finally, he orders the city razed. Buildings are torn down, walls are demolished. Thebes, one of Greece's most powerful cities, center of Boeotian culture, legendary home of Cadmus and Heracles, is erased from existence. Only one building is spared, the house where the poet Pindar once lived, preserved out of respect for poetry, even while murdering poets' descendants. This is Greek destroying Greek, not foreign conquest, but one Greek power obliterating another as a lesson to all of Greece. And here's the darkest detail. Alexander sought approval from the Greek League before destroying Thebes. He presented the matter to the other Greek city-states. What should Thebes' punishment be? They voted for annihilation. Let that sink in. Greek cities voted to obliterate another Greek city, not because of ethnic hatred or foreign conquest, but as political calculation. Thebes had been powerful, had threatened other cities, had sided with Persia during the Persian Wars a century and a half earlier. Old grudges and current fears combined. The vote passed. Diodorus Siculus records it. The Council of the Greeks voted to raze the city and sell the inhabitants into slavery, partly because of anger at Thebes for siding with the barbarians against Greece, and partly from fear of her strength. The justification was revenge for events 150 years in the past, and preventive destruction to eliminate future threat. Arrian provides more detail. The Thebans were treated with extreme cruelty, not in accordance with Alexander's nature, but because the Greeks who served with him were eager to gratify their own private hatreds. The Phocians and Plataeans and other Boeotians who had suffered at Theban hands now had their revenge. Alexander's Macedonian forces did the killing, but Greek allies participated enthusiastically. This was Greeks slaughtering Greeks with Greek approval. The destruction was thorough. Plutarch describes the aftermath. The city was razed to the ground except for the citadel and the house of Pindar. Of the citizens, 6,000 were killed and more than 30,000 sold into slavery. The total population of Thebes had been about 50,000, meaning Alexander killed or enslaved approximately 75% of the city. The 6,000 killed weren't combatants. Most Theban soldiers died during the battle. These were civilians massacred after the city fell. Alexander's forces went house to house, killing anyone they found. The slaughter lasted for hours. Then came the enslavement. 30,000 people, entire families, elderly, children, women, men, were rounded up and sold at slave markets. Some were purchased by Alexander's soldiers as personal slaves. Others were sold to slave traders who distributed them throughout the Mediterranean. Theban families were broken apart forever, scattered as property across dozens of cities. And the razing was literal. Macedonian forces and Greek allies spent weeks dismantling Thebes. Buildings were torn down stone by stone. The fortifications that had made Thebes a military power were demolished. The agora where Thebans had governed themselves for centuries was obliterated. Temples, homes, public buildings, all destroyed. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to cities that resist Macedonian power. This is what Alexander will do, and Greece, fragmented, afraid, unable to unite, accepted it. Some cities even celebrated it. But here's the pattern this reveals. Greek civilization, which claimed ethnic solidarity against outsiders, would destroy itself when convenient. The bonds of Hellenism, the shared language and religion and culture, all of it evaporated when power politics were at stake. Alexander was Macedonian, but he commanded Greeks with Greek approval to destroy a Greek city. The destruction of Thebes wasn't foreign conquest. It was Greek civilization eating itself. Thebes was eventually refounded after Alexander's death, but it never recovered its former power. The new Thebes was a shadow, populated by scattered survivors and new settlers. The continuity was broken. The Thebes that fought at Plataea, that fielded the sacred band, that challenged Sparta and Athens for supremacy, that Thebes died in 335 BCE. The ruins of ancient Thebes are sparse today. Most stones were reused in later construction. There's little to see of the city that was once one of Greece's greatest powers. Alexander erased it, and Greece approved. The pattern of Greek violence against helots, prisoners, slaves, women, children, allied cities reached its logical conclusion: total annihilation of one of their own. Chaeronea, August 338. BCE, the Greek city-states face Philip II of Macedon in pitched battle. Athens, Thebes, and their allies have assembled a coalition army, approximately 35,000 hoplites, to resist Macedonian expansion. This is Greece's last stand for independence. They lose. Philip's forces, including an 18-year-old Alexander commanding the cavalry, crush the Greek coalition. The sacred band of Thebes, the elite unit of 300 paired lovers, legendary for never retreating, fights to the last man. They die in formation, exactly where they fought, bodies piled together. Plutarch records that Philip, viewing their corpses, wept and said, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything unseemly." But the dead sacred band was just prologue. The aftermath of Chaeronea ended Greek independence forever. Here's what happened. Philip, having defeated the Greek coalition militarily, imposed a settlement. He created the League of Corinth, a pan-Hellenic alliance that ostensibly gave Greek cities autonomy, while making them subordinate to Macedonian hegemony. The terms were clear. The Greek cities would maintain their governments, but foreign policy was controlled by Macedonia. They would provide troops for Philip's wars. They would accept Macedonian garrisons in key strategic locations. This was independence in name only. Demosthenes, the Athenian orator who had spent years warning Athens about the Macedonian threat, understood. We have become slaves while pretending to be free. But opposition was futile. Macedonia controlled Greece militarily. Resistance meant destruction, as Thebes would learn when it rebelled against Alexander 7 years later. The pattern of Greek history, centuries of fierce independence, rival city-states battling for supremacy, democracy, and autonomy defended with blood, ended at Chaeronea. The city-states that had resisted Persian invasion, that had built empires, that had fought decades-long wars against each other while jealously guarding their freedom, became subjects of Macedonian kings. And here's the darkest irony. The Greeks had done this to themselves, not through cowardice or betrayal, but through the very patterns we've documented throughout this script. Centuries of Greek-on-Greek violence, the enslavement, the massacres, the betrayals, the systematic brutality, had weakened Greek civilization to the point where an external power could conquer it. Athens had exhausted itself in the Peloponnesian War, destroying its own empire through brutal overreach. Sparta had destroyed itself trying to maintain hegemony through terror. Thebes had risen and fallen. Every major Greek city had enemies within Greece, cities they had brutalized or been brutalized by, grudges that spanned generations. When Philip invaded, the Greeks couldn't unite effectively. Too much hatred, too much history, too many competing interests. Athens and Thebes allied only because Macedonia threatened both, but dozens of other cities sided with Philip or stayed neutral, seeing him as useful against their local rivals. Philip and Alexander exploited the divisions Greeks had created through centuries of violence against each other. The pattern of Greek brutality, turned inward for so long, had created the conditions for conquest, and conquest came swiftly. Philip controlled Greece by 337 BCA. He was assassinated in 336 BCA. Alexander crushed Greek resistance in 335 BCA with the destruction of Thebes. Then Alexander turned east, dragging Greek soldiers with him to conquer Persia, Egypt, and parts of India. Greek hoplites fought and died in Alexander's wars, not for Greek independence, but for Macedonian imperial ambitions. The Hellenistic period that followed, after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, saw Greek culture spread across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Greek language, art, philosophy, and architecture influenced vast regions. But political independence? Gone. The Greek city-states became pawns in larger conflicts, controlled by Macedonian dynasties, eventually absorbed by Rome. The pattern continued. Greek culture thrived while Greek freedom died. The civilization that invented democracy, that prized autonomy above all, that fought desperately to remain independent, lost its independence through its own internal conflicts and the brutality it had normalized. The battlefield of Chaeronea has been extensively excavated. The mass grave of the sacred band was discovered. 254 bodies, arranged in perfect formation even in death. A lion monument marks the site. Tourists visit, remembering the sacred band's last stand. But Chaeronea means more than a heroic defeat. It means the end of Greek freedom, the culmination of centuries of Greek self-destruction, the moment when all the patterns we've documented, the brutality, the slavery, the massacres, the betrayals, resulted in conquest. Greek civilization didn't fall to barbarians. It fell to Macedonians who had learned from Greek warfare, exploited Greek divisions, and conquered Greeks using tactics and strategies Greeks had pioneered against each other. The civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, and art also gave us systematic violence that ultimately destroyed itself. Chaeronea was the final payment for centuries of brutality. The bill came due, and Greek independence died there, killed by the very patterns of violence Greeks had created. So here we are, 30 cases, 30 documented truths about ancient Greece that don't make it into the textbooks, or if they do, they're buried in footnotes, sanitized, explained away. We started with exposed infants left on mountainsides. We ended with the conquest that destroyed Greek independence. In between, systematic slavery, state-sanctioned murder, democratic genocide, ritualized brutality, and violence so pervasive it structured every aspect of Greek life from birth to death. This wasn't occasional darkness in an otherwise enlightened civilization. This was Greek civilization, the philosophy and the infanticide, the democracy and the slave markets, the Olympic glory, and the broken bodies. All of it, together, simultaneously. That's what makes it so disturbing. Not that ancient people were brutal. Every ancient society was brutal, but that the same society that produced Socrates also executed him. The same democracy that debated justice voted for genocide. The same culture that created the Parthenon powered it with slaves dying in mines. The Greeks themselves knew this. Read their own historians. Thucydides records massacre after massacre with weary horror. Herodotus describes Persian amazement at Greek capacity for violence. Plutarch catalogues atrocities while trying to find moral lessons in them. Greek writers documented their society's darkness. They just didn't see it as darkness. They saw it as reality, as natural, as necessary. That's the pattern. Normalize brutality, and it becomes invisible. Call infanticide family planning. Call slavery economic necessity. Call genocide strategy. Use clean language for dirty practices, and people accept them. We do it too. Our societies have their own violence, their own exploitation, their own normalized brutalities that future generations will judge. The Greek pattern isn't ancient history. It's human nature under pressure.